For most of human history, human life did not end in a bed, behind a locked door, beneath a roof filled with quiet light. It ended a few feet from a fire that could fail. When the flame weakened, warmth shrank, sight shrank, safety shrank, and the known world narrowed to a trembling ring in the dark. What we now call an evening was once a brief negotiation with cold, fear, and limits the body could not overcome. If that is true, then perhaps one of the deepest losses in human history was not the end of the day, but the end of everything beyond the fire. So why did 90% of human history end at the fire? For most of the human story, a day did not end because someone decided it was time to rest. It did not end because a task list was complete, because a room had grown quiet, or because a clock said the useful hours were over. It ended because the world itself became smaller. As light faded, distance disappeared first, then detail, then confidence. The ground that had seemed ordinary in late afternoon became uncertain underfoot. Trees lost their shape, paths lost their edges, faces became harder to read. What remained was not simply darkness, but a steady reduction of what a human being could safely do. That is the beginning of the question in this title. To say that much of human history ended at the fire is not to claim that all activity stopped the moment the sun went down. It means something more limited, and perhaps more revealing. For a very long time, the human day could only be extended a little beyond sunset, and that extension depended on flame. Without it, the useful world contracted quickly. With it, people gained a narrow zone of borrowed time. In that small space, the last human hours of the day could continue. Food could still be eaten, tools could still be held close and checked by flickering light. Children could be kept warm. Older people could remain near the group without surrendering entirely to the cold. Bodies could settle, voices could continue, and the group could remain, for a little longer, inside a world still shaped by human presence rather than by night itself. This is why the fire matters so much in the history of our species. Not only because it gave heat, and not only because it gave light, but because it delayed the moment when the day was no longer truly ours. The modern mind is not used to thinking this way. Today, in many parts of the world, evening feels open. After sunset, life continues almost without interruption. Streets remain visible, homes remain bright. Work, reading, cooking, travel, and private thought can all continue deep into the night. It is easy, from within that world, to imagine that darkness is a surface problem solved by technology. But for most humans who ever lived, darkness was not merely the absence of illumination. It was a condition that changed the terms of existence. It altered what the eye could do, what the body could risk, and how far the group could remain active before caution overcame intention. Near the beginning of human life on Earth, long before permanent lighting, sealed buildings, or insulated rooms, that limit would have been felt night after night in ordinary ways. The end of the day was not an abstract boundary. It arrived physically. The air cooled, the visible world retreated. Movement became more costly. Separation from the group became more dangerous. Even simple tasks demanded more effort and brought less certainty. Under such conditions, a fire was not a luxury placed at the center of life for symbolism alone. It was a practical answer to a shrinking world. Yet even fire did not erase the problem. It only pushed the edge back a little. Its light did not restore the landscape. Its warmth did not turn night into day. Its protection was local, temporary, and fragile. A fire made a human evening possible, but only within limits. And those limits may be one of the quietest facts in our history. For an immense span of time, human beings did not control when the day truly ended. They negotiated with that ending. They held it back briefly. They sat beside it. And when the flames sank low enough, the world beyond human reach returned. If that was once the normal condition of our species, what did the coming of darkness really take away each night? Long before history learned how to keep the light. A modern person can choose to stay awake almost indefinitely and still feel surrounded by a usable world. Light can be summoned with a finger. Heat can be held inside walls. Roads remain legible after sunset. A person can walk to another room, another building, even another part of a city, and still move through a space shaped for human eyes. That experience is so normal now that it quietly rewrites the past in our imagination. We begin to think that people in earlier times faced the same evening we do, only with fewer conveniences. But the deeper difference was not convenience, it was control. For most of human history, people did not simply possess less efficient lighting, they lived much closer to the point where light itself failed, and with it failed a whole set of abilities that we now treat as permanent. To understand the title of this video, it helps to notice that the ancient evening was not a long stretch of optional personal time. It was the final margin left after daylight had already done most of the work. In that older human world, day was still the main container of movement, gathering, watching, carrying, processing food, searching for materials and reading the land. When the sun fell, the body did not suddenly become helpless, but its relationship to space changed sharply. A short distance could become a serious obstacle. A familiar path could demand caution. Objects could still be touched, but not judged well from afar. A sound from outside the circle of light could be heard without being understood. The mind had to fill gaps the eye could no longer manage. That kind of evening narrows action long before sleep begins. It is not just darker. It is smaller, slower, and less certain. This is why the fire should be understood not merely as a source of comfort, but as a device for keeping a human world in existence a little longer. Around it, people could continue being a group after the land itself had stopped cooperating. They could remain visible to one another. They could recognize expression, gesture, injury, age, and need. They could keep food edible and bodies warmer than the air around them allowed. They could delay dispersal into silence. In a very practical sense, fire preserved social space after sunset. Without it, the end of daylight would have pushed people more quickly towards stillness, closeness, and caution. With it, there was a brief extension of life before the deeper claims of darkness took over. Near the beginnings of our species, that extension may have mattered more than we easily realize, because it did not only lengthen activity, it changed the texture of ending. A day closed more gradually when there was flame to gather around. There was a last period in which the group could remain together inside warmth and visibility, instead of yielding at once to cold, obscurity, and the difficulty of doing almost anything beyond touch. This does not mean that every prehistoric evening looked the same, or that every landscape forced identical habits. Human groups lived in different climates, terrains, and shelter conditions. The point is more careful than that. Across enormous spans of time, and under many different circumstances, humans remained a species whose evening possibilities were tightly bounded by natural light and by the local strength of fire. That boundary is the real subject here. A day did not end only when people became tired. It ended when human presence could no longer hold enough ground against the dark to keep ordinary life going. And if the fire marked that last hold against the shrinking world, then perhaps it was not simply where people spent the evening, but where the human day made its final stand. There is another reason this question matters, and it is easy to miss if we think only in terms of survival. When we imagine early humans near a fire, we often picture a simple scene: people sitting together, keeping warm, waiting for sleep. But the deeper point is that the fire may have shaped not only what they did at night, but what a night could even be. In the modern world, evening often feels like an extension of personal freedom. It is the time when obligations loosen, when private thought expands, when activity continues under stable light that seems almost independent of the natural world. For most of human history, that kind of evening barely existed. The hours after sunset were not a second day. They were a narrowing corridor between the end of useful light and the deeper surrender of the body to darkness, cold, and reduced certainty. That is why the title does not point to a dramatic final event, but to a repeated condition. Human history, for a very long time, may be understood as a sequence of days that reached outward under the sun and then folded inward at the fire. The fire was not the whole of life, but it was often the last place where life still felt organized by human intention. Beyond it lay a world that could still be heard, smelled, or imagined, but no longer fully managed. The contrast is important. Daylight allowed range. It allowed attention to spread across land, distance, movement, weather, tracks, plants, tools, and other people. Firelight did the opposite. It gathered that spread-out world back into a small center. The body came closer to the group. Hands came closer to the object being handled. Voices came closer to the ear. Children came closer to adults. elders came closer to warmth. Thought itself may have become more inward because space had already become small. Near the long beginning of our species, before artificial light could separate human wakefulness from the setting sun, this inward movement was probably one of the most ordinary patterns of existence. Not a rare ritual, not an exceptional hardship, but a repeated human fact. A day went outward, then came back in. It opened across land, then closed around flame. Even where shelter existed, the problem was not fully solved, because shelter without reliable light and heat still left the human world contracted. Fire was the thing that made a temporary center possible, yet it is important to remain careful. We do not need to imagine every evening as fearful, or every group as sitting in silence before danger. The evidence does not allow such certainty, and the truth is likely more varied. Some nights were surely calm, some were social, some may have held conversation, maintenance, food preparation, quiet observation, or simple rest. But even in that variation, one limit remained widely real. Once the fire weakened, the zone of manageable life weakened with it. That is the sober claim inside the title. Not that human beings were powerless, and not that they lacked culture or agency, but that their agency at night was often local and fragile. In that sense, the fire marked a threshold. It was where the day could be prolonged, but not conquered. It was where the human world persisted, but only in reduced form. And if that pattern repeated across most of the time our species has existed, then perhaps one of the oldest structures of human life was this simple movement, outward into the day, inward to the fire, and finally into a darkness no one could fully command. The reason darkness mattered so much is not only that the world became harder to see, it is that the human body was never especially strong in the dark to begin with. We are not nocturnal animals, and we are not built like creatures that move through night with ease. Human eyes work very well in daylight compared with many other species. They are good at color, detail, and long-range interpretation when light is available. But when light drops, those strengths begin to weaken. Colors fade first, fine detail disappears, shapes flatten, distance becomes harder to judge. Movement can still be noticed, but meaning becomes less certain. A branch, a stone, a person, and an animal may all become harder to distinguish at the distance where a decision would matter. This is one of the quiet biological facts behind the title. For most of human history, night did not merely hide the landscape. It reduced the usefulness of a body that depended heavily on sight to move safely and act with confidence. That matters because humans are a strange kind of animal. We are not especially fast. We are not covered in insulating fur. We do not have large claws, thick skin, or natural night vision that would allow us to stay active after sunset with the same assurance many other creatures possess. Our strength has long depended on something else: cooperation, memory, planning, tool use, and the ability to read environments well. But nearly all of those advantages work best when enough of the world can still be perceived clearly. In daylight, a human being can scan the ground, notice patterns, track movement, recognize another face, judge a path, carry an object, and coordinate with others over distance. As darkness deepens, those strengths do not vanish, but they become compressed into a much smaller range. The body can still move, but with more uncertainty. The mind can still decide, but with less information. The group can still act, but within a shorter circle of reliable awareness. Near the beginning of our species, before modern lighting changed the terms of evening, this biological limit would have been present every single day. It did not need to become dramatic to matter. Even a small rise in uncertainty can reshape behavior if it happens night after night across thousands of generations. A foot placed badly on uneven ground, a delayed response to movement, a missed object, a failure to recognize distance, a body cooling too fast while stationary outdoors. These are not theatrical dangers, but they are enough to narrow life. That narrowing is the key. The human body in darkness is not useless. It is simply less capable of extending the same confident world that daylight allows. Fire mattered because it compensated, in part, for a body with these limits. It restored some vision, some warmth, some orientation, some ability to remain socially connected after sunset. It did not make humans nocturnal. It did not turn the night into a safe open field. It only reduced the mismatch between what the body needed and what darkness removed. In that sense, fire was not merely a cultural tool placed on top of human life. It answered a biological problem that was already there. A day ended at the fire because beyond that light, the body itself began to lose too much of what made human action steady, shared, and reliable. If our species had been built to function in darkness with the ease of many night-active animals, would evening ever have become such a narrow place at all? The weakness of the human body in darkness is not only a matter of vision, it is also a matter of temperature, posture, and energy. Humans do not simply need light to continue the day. They need a surrounding world that the body can tolerate for many hours without excessive cost. Once daylight fades, that tolerance can narrow quickly, especially outdoors or in lightly sheltered conditions. A warm afternoon can become a cold night with surprising speed. The same body that moved well across open ground during the day may lose comfort and control when forced into stillness after sunset. Muscles cool, fingers become less precise. The desire to conserve heat begins to compete with the desire to remain active. This too helps explain the title. For much of human history, the day did not end only because people could no longer see far enough. It ended because staying active outside the circle of warmth demanded more from the body than the body could easily afford. This is especially important for a species like ours. Human beings are unusual in many ways, but one of the most important is that we live through a body that is both capable and exposed. We can walk long distances, carry objects, make tools, and cooperate in flexible groups. Yet we do so with bare skin compared with furred animals, with a narrow temperature range for comfort, and with a high dependence on steady energy intake. We are not shaped to sit comfortably through cold darkness without assistance from clothing, shelter, or fire. Near the beginning of our species, when all three existed in more limited and variable forms than they do now, the arrival of night would have pressed on the body in quiet but cumulative ways. This pressure did not need to be extreme to matter. Small losses in warmth and dexterity can change what is worth doing. They can shorten conversation, reduce movement, limit repairs, discourage travel, and draw people physically closer together. The body begins to choose economy. It seeks the least costly way to remain safe until morning. That shift may have been one of the most common endings in human history. Under daylight, a group could spread out across terrain, process the world, and act with relative flexibility. After dark, the logic changed. Energy had to be preserved. Heat had to be protected. Exposure had to be reduced. The human body encouraged inwardness not because it preferred passivity, but because night made activity more expensive. Fire answered that problem directly. It gave light, but it also gave a pocket of climate. Around it, hands could remain useful longer. Skin could avoid losing heat as quickly. Bodies could rest without yielding so completely to the surrounding air. Children and older adults, who are often more vulnerable to temperature stress, could remain inside a more stable zone. Even food and water could be handled in ways that better supported the body through the night. When seen this way, fire was not simply an object people looked at. It was a local correction to an environment the human body could not comfortably master after sunset. Near our species' long origin, that correction would have had deep consequences for how evening felt and how long it could remain human in a practical sense. Without warmth, darkness narrows life faster. Without light, the body moves less confidently. Without both together, night becomes not just dimmer, but harder to inhabit. This is why the end of the day may have often gathered around fire rather than extending far beyond it. The body itself kept reminding people where the manageable world stopped. And if night repeatedly pushed human beings toward the place where warmth and visibility were concentrated, then perhaps the fire was not only a tool in the landscape, but the place where the human body could still remain fully human for a little while longer. There is one more biological limit that matters here, and it may be the most easily overlooked because it feels so ordinary to us now. Humans do not merely survive by having bodies that move. We survive by having bodies that coordinate well with one another. We read faces, track hands, notice posture, hear tone, and adjust our behavior through constant streams of small signals. Much of human competence is social before it is individual. A person does not need perfect strength if the group can coordinate. A person does not need perfect instincts if others can warn, guide, or assist. But that social advantage depends on a world that remains readable. In darkness, that shared readability begins to weaken. Faces lose detail, gestures lose clarity, the exact direction of someone's gaze becomes harder to see, small movements that would be obvious in daylight become ambiguous. Even speech, though still useful, must carry more of the burden once visual coordination fades. This matters because the human body is not just weak in the dark as a solitary organism, it is weaker in the dark as a social organism. Near the beginning of our species, long before artificial lighting could preserve visibility deep into the evening, this reduction would have shaped not only movement, but group life itself. During the day, cooperation could spread across distance. People could separate and still remain meaningfully aware of each other through sight, gesture, pace, and orientation in the landscape. After sunset, that web tightened. The body did not stop being social, but social life became more local, more compressed, and more dependent on closeness. That is one reason a fire could become so central. It did not only help one person see, it allowed several people to remain visible to each other at once. It protected not only the eye and the skin, but the small signals by which a group remained a group. Around a flame, expression returned. Hands became legible again. A child's discomfort, an elder's fatigue, an injury, a request, a warning, a simple glance toward the darkness beyond the light. All of these could still be shared in a way the night otherwise reduced. This may help explain why the end of the human day was not simply a matter of individual tiredness. It was also a matter of how long the group could keep functioning as a coordinated unit. Beyond a certain point, darkness did not merely make life dim. It made it harder to remain collectively intelligent. And that phrase may be close to the heart of the title. Human beings are not the strongest animals because of claws or speed. We are strong because we pool attention. We extend memory across generations. We organize labor. We watch one another. We respond to weakness. We build action from many partial perceptions joined together. But when darkness strips away the range and clarity of those perceptions, the group loses some of its most important advantages. Fire partly restored them. It kept a small zone of mutual visibility alive. It allowed the body, the eye, the voice, and the group to remain linked beyond sunset. Yet even that restoration had limits. The circle was still small. The light was uneven. The surrounding world remained mostly unavailable. Human coordination could continue, but only inwardly, in reduced space, for reduced purposes, and for a reduced stretch of time. That is why the human evening, for most of history, may have been less a continuation of the day than a careful retreat into the last place where bodies and minds could still work together reliably. And if our species depended from the start on social intelligence more than on natural night strength, then perhaps the fire was never just warmth and light. Perhaps it was the final place each day where the human group could still fully see itself, before houses with sealed rooms, before lamps on tables, before streets stayed visible after sunset. The fire may have been the first real border humans could make at night. Not a wall in the modern sense, not a permanent structure, and not a perfect defense, but a boundary all the same. It marked where the human world still held together and where it began to fall away. This is one of the deepest ideas inside the title. If much of human history ended at the fire, that does not mean the fire was simply the last thing people looked at before sleep. It means the fire may have been the edge of the only space that still belonged, in a practical sense, to human control. During the day, the world opened outward. People could move across ground, scan distance, notice tracks, gather materials, work with tools, follow others, and keep the group connected through shared visibility. But after dark, that outward world became less available. The landscape did not disappear, yet much of it slipped beyond useful reach. In that change, the fire became more than warmth and more than light. It became a line. Inside its reach, bodies could remain oriented. Faces could still be recognized. Food could still be handled. Small tasks could continue. Children could be kept near. Elders could remain in a zone the body could tolerate. Voices could still move between people whose expressions were visible enough to matter. Outside that reach, the world still existed, but it no longer existed on terms that were easily human. That contrast matters because human life has always depended on making space usable. We do not merely occupy land, we organize it. We turn some areas into places of action, memory, safety, and social meaning. Near the beginning of our species, long before the technologies that now shape indoor life, fire may have been one of the oldest ways of doing this after sunset. It did not create a building, but it created a center. And once there is a center, there is also an edge. That edge may have been one of the most important daily realities in early human existence. A few steps could separate visibility from obscurity, warmth from cold, shared attention from uncertainty. In daylight, those differences were spread gradually across terrain. At night, fire condensed them into a much tighter geography. One small area remained humanized. Beyond it, the environment reclaimed its usual terms. It is important to keep this idea careful and grounded. Fire was not a magical shield. It did not guarantee safety, and it did not remove all danger from the night. Different landscapes, climates, shelters, and seasons would have changed how much protection it offered. The point is not that every group lived in the same way, but that fire repeatedly served as a local boundary between a more manageable space and a less manageable one. That alone is enough to make it historically central. For most of human time on Earth, people did not have large, brightly lit environments extending deep into the evening. They had smaller pockets of control, and among the oldest of those pockets was the circle made by flame. Once we see that, the title begins to sound less metaphorical and more literal. The day may have often ended at the fire because the fire was where the human world stopped holding its shape. Beyond that border, the land was still there, the night was still there, and life was still there. But ordinary human life could no longer spread into it with the same steadiness. If fire was one of the first borders our species could make in darkness, then what kind of world stood just outside it, waiting every evening for the light to thin? A border does not need stone, wood, or law in order to shape behavior. It only needs to separate what can be done from what can no longer be done. In that sense, fire may have functioned as one of the oldest boundaries in human life. Not because it enclosed a territory in the modern political sense, but because it organized the difference between a place where human activity could continue and a place where it became harder to trust the body, the eye, and the group. That distinction may have returned night after night across immense stretches of time. Near the long beginning of our species, before built environments could hold back darkness in any lasting way, people may have experienced evening less as a gradual dimming and more as a shrinking of usable space toward a center. Fire created that center. It did not eliminate the surrounding night, but it gave shape to what remained possible inside it. This is why the fire should not be imagined only as an object at the middle of camp. It may be better understood as a boundary maker. Its light defined what could still be seen. Its warmth defined where the body could still remain with less strain. Its presence defined where social attention could still gather without dissolving into uncertainty. Around it, tasks did not become easy, but they remained possible. Beyond it, possibility itself thinned. A person could still move outward, of course, but movement would become more costly, less informed, and less connected to the group. This is how borders work at the most basic level. They do not merely block, they reshape choices. They alter what feels worth doing. They draw bodies inward by making distance more expensive. Fire may have done exactly that in the ancient evening. It pulled the human world toward itself, not only because it was attractive, but because the conditions outside its reach were less compatible with ordinary human action. For a species whose strength depended so much on coordination, observation, and flexible use of the environment, that inward pull would have been profound. It meant that after dark, the social body and the physical body gathered into the same reduced space. The group did not simply rest near the fire. It may have become most fully itself there, because that was the last area where enough visibility, warmth, and shared perception remained. Near the origin of human life as we know it, this may have been one of the oldest repeated shapes of evening, the day expanding across land, then contracting toward a small illuminated zone where the group could still function with some coherence. That is a very different experience from the modern night, which often feels open, connected, and architecturally stable long after sunset. Today, walls define borders. Electric light stretches them farther. Climate control softens the body's vulnerability. But for most of human history, those protections were absent or limited. The border of night had to be made in simpler ways. Fire was among the clearest. And because it was temporary, local, and fragile, the human border it created was temporary, local, and fragile too. That fragility matters. A wall remains even when no one watches it. A fire does not. It must be kept alive. It fades, shifts, weakens, and finally collapses into ash. So the border it made was never fixed. It had to be maintained moment by moment, and that may be one reason the end of the day was so tangible. People did not merely cross from light into dark once. They watched the border itself diminish. The human space became smaller as the flame became smaller. If that was once a normal feature of existence, then perhaps the most ancient border in human history was not one we built to keep others out, but one we built each evening to hold the night back for a little longer. What makes this border so important is that it was not simply drawn against danger, it was drawn against disappearance. During the day, the human world spreads naturally. Land can be read at a distance. People can separate and still remain part of the same shared field of attention. Objects, paths, weather, bodies, tools, and signals all belong to a space that stays legible enough for human action. But at night, without strong and lasting light, that legibility begins to collapse. The world does not vanish, but much of it stops being available in the way human life requires. In that moment, fire becomes more than a useful thing. It becomes a place where the visible world is held together long enough for human life to remain recognizable to itself. That may be the deepest meaning of calling it a border. A border separates two kinds of reality. Inside the range of the flame, the world is still partly organized by human needs. Things can still be found, judged, shared, and responded to. Outside it, those same things become harder to interpret and therefore harder to live with. Near the beginning of our species, before the long development of durable nighttime environments, this difference may have shaped the evening more than any abstract sense of time did. Night was not just later in the day. It was another condition altogether, one in which the body lost range, the eye lost certainty, and the group lost some of its collective clarity. Fire did not solve that condition. It created a small exception inside it. That is why the title points to something larger than warmth or comfort. If much of human history ended at the fire, then the fire may have marked the last place where a fully social and practical human world still continued. This idea also helps explain why the border mattered even when no immediate threat was present. A person does not need a predator nearby in order for the night to impose limits. Cold, uneven ground, uncertainty of distance, reduced coordination, and the simple cost of moving without enough visibility are already enough. A border is meaningful whenever crossing it changes the terms of existence. Fire likely did that every evening. It established a zone where ordinary actions still made sense, and beyond that zone, the same actions became less efficient, less safe, or less connected to the group. That may have made the human evening feel not expansive, but concentrated. The group gathered not only because the fire was pleasant, but because it was where the world remained most workable. The air was more tolerable, the faces were visible, the immediate surroundings could still be interpreted. The small movements that hold social life together still had a place to happen, and because that place was limited, human life itself may have taken on a different shape after dark. Instead of extending outward, it folded inward. Instead of enlarging the world, it preserved a center. That inward movement may be one of the oldest nightly patterns our species ever knew. It also reveals something important about human history more broadly. Long before we could dominate night with architecture and electricity, we learned to survive it by creating islands within it. Fire was perhaps the earliest and most important of those islands. Not a perfect refuge, not a final answer, but a local world held against a larger darkness. And if the first border humans made at night was also the place where the day most often came to rest, then perhaps what ended at the fire was not just activity, but the last remaining reach of the human world itself. What we call evening today is so familiar that it can seem almost natural. The day ends, but life does not. Lights turn on, rooms remain warm, streets stay visible, People continue reading, cooking, speaking, traveling, working, or simply remaining awake inside a world that still feels available to them. Because this pattern is so ordinary now, it becomes easy to imagine that evening has always been a long, usable stretch of human time. But for most of human history, that idea would have made little sense. Evening was not a second day. It was not a broad, flexible period of private activity unfolding after sunset. It was something smaller, shorter, and more concentrated. In many times and places, the hours after dark were likely gathered into a narrow circle of light and warmth rather than spread across a fully livable night. This matters because the title of the video depends on understanding just how limited that world once was. If much of human history ended at the fire, then evening itself was not an open landscape of possibility. It was the last reduced form of the day, held together briefly before the wider darkness took over. Near the beginning of our species, before stable artificial lighting reshaped human expectations, the fall of darkness did not merely signal a new mood. It altered the scale of life. Daytime allowed range. People could move across ground, notice materials, judge paths, observe others at distance, and act in relation to a visible environment. After sunset, all of that narrowed. The body drew closer to warmth. The group drew closer to itself. Activity drew closer to the hands. Thought may even have drawn closer to whatever could still be seen and managed within the immediate circle. This is why it is useful to imagine the ancient evening not as a long night beginning, but as a small circle forming. Inside that circle, human life could continue in a reduced, but still meaningful way. Food could still be finished or shared. A tool could still be checked. A child could still be settled. An older body could still remain within a tolerable zone of warmth. Voices could still move between visible faces. But the key is that this continuation happened inwardly, not outwardly. The world did not remain open and simply become dimmer. It closed around a center. That center was often fire. We should be careful not to make this too uniform. Human groups lived under many different conditions, in different climates, with different shelters, materials, and habits. Some evenings would have been calmer, longer, or more social than others. But across that variation, one broad truth remains widely plausible and grounded. Without strong and lasting artificial light, the hours after sunset did not support the same kind of spread-out human life that daylight did. Evening, for most humans who ever lived, was probably not spacious. It was concentrated. It gathered bodies, attention, and practical action into a much smaller field. That difference changes how we hear the title. The fire was not simply where people happened to spend the end of the day. It may have been the very thing that made an evening possible at all. Without it, darkness would have arrived more abruptly as a limit. With it, the day could soften into a brief final zone of human presence. So the question is not only why people sat near fires. The deeper question is whether, for most of our history, evening itself was never really a long night, but only a small human circle held together before the dark became too large again. A small circle does not only change where people are, it changes what kinds of life can still happen. When we picture a long evening today, we often imagine separate activities unfolding at once. One person reads, another works. Someone else cooks, walks, listens, or remains awake alone under steady light. Modern evening allows human attention to spread out into different rooms, different tasks, and different rhythms. But a much older evening would have gathered those possibilities inward. When light and warmth are local rather than everywhere, life becomes less dispersed. The group does not simply stay near the fire by habit. It stays near the fire because the conditions for being human in any full and practical sense have become concentrated there. That is the deeper meaning of saying evening was once a small circle rather than a long night. It was not merely shorter in time, it was denser in space. Near the beginning of our species, before built interiors and reliable lighting changed the shape of darkness, the hours after sunset may have brought a repeated compression of human existence. Bodies came closer together, attention came closer to nearby things, movement became more selective, tasks had to justify themselves. A person could still rise, reach, adjust, speak, eat, handle an object, or look toward the edge of the light, but those actions were no longer embedded in a broad, visible world. They occurred inside a limited field that had to support many needs at once. This likely affected the rhythm of evening in very ordinary ways. Activities that depended on range or fine visibility would have become harder to continue. Activities suited to nearness would have remained more possible. Care, warmth, eating, quiet repair, observation of others, perhaps conversation in some settings, perhaps long silences in others, all of these fit more naturally into a narrow circle than travel, dispersed labour, or movement across uncertain ground. The point is not to romanticize the scene or imagine identical nights everywhere. The point is structural. Once the human world contracts to a local centre, the kinds of actions that survive that contraction also change. Evening becomes less a continuation of daytime variety and more a final gathering of what can still be done without spreading beyond the reach of light and warmth. This also helps explain why the fire may have felt central without needing to be dramatic. It was not only that people needed it, it was that so many different forms of need converged there at once. Vision, heat, food, bodily rest, childcare, attention to elders, awareness of others, and simple orientation in space could all be partly sustained in that one reduced zone. In daylight, those functions could spread across landscape. After dark, they folded back together. That folding may have been one of the oldest patterns of human evening. The day separates people across tasks and distances. Night gathers them back to a point where ordinary life is still possible. Near the long origin of human history, that point may often have been no wider than the reach of firelight. And because it was small, the difference between inside and outside would have been felt constantly. One step farther from the light, and faces become vague. Another step, and the ground becomes less readable. Farther still, and the world is present, but no longer socially shared in the same way. This is why evening may have been less an expanse than a borderland. It was a reduced human zone pressed against a much larger darkness. If that was once the normal shape of life after sunset, then perhaps the ancient evening was not defined mainly by what people chose to do, but by how much of the world remained available for doing anything at all. The most important consequence of this small circle evening may be that it changed how human time itself was experienced. Today, many people feel that the hours after sunset belong to them in a personal way. Evening can be stretched, filled, divided, postponed, or even ignored. It often feels like open time, time that can still be shaped by preference. But in a much older human world, evening was probably less like an open possession and more like a narrowing remainder. It was what was left once daylight had already withdrawn most of the usable world. That remainder could still matter deeply. It could still contain warmth, attention, care, food, memory, or silence. But it was not broad. It was held inside limits that the body, the landscape, and the reach of fire all imposed together. This is why the title points to something more than the practical use of flame. If much of human history ended at the fire, then perhaps what ended there was not only motion across land, but the larger daytime sense that the world was available. Near the beginning of our species, before stable lighting turned night into a managed extension of day, evening may have often been the hour when availability itself began to close. The group could still remain together, but in compressed form. The body could still remain active, but in smaller ways. The mind could still stay awake, but with fewer outward objects to act upon. Under those conditions, time after sunset may have felt less expansive and more gathered, less like opportunity and more like a final holding space before night fully claimed the world beyond the fire. That may be why the circle matters so much. A circle is not only a shape in space, it also creates a shape in time. When people are drawn inward to light and warmth, they are also drawn inward to a more limited set of actions and rhythms. A hand can still reach. A face can still be seen. A voice can still cross the small distance between bodies. But the wider world no longer invites the same range of decisions. It recedes from the senses, and with it recedes a kind of human freedom that daylight had made ordinary. This does not mean ancient evenings were empty. On the contrary, they may have been full in a concentrated way, full of nearness, bodily awareness, practical restraint, and the last shared moments before rest. Yet even that fullness would have unfolded inside a world already reduced. The evening was real, but it was not large. It was a human center surviving briefly after the larger environment had become less usable. Once we understand that, the title sounds less exaggerated and more precise. The fire was not simply where people gathered because it was pleasant. It may have been where time itself changed scale. Daytime time was extended across land and movement. Evening time was folded inward around a source of light that could not last forever. Near the long origin of human history, that pattern may have repeated so often that it became one of the oldest unspoken structures of life. The day widens, the evening contracts, the fire holds the center, and then even that center begins to weaken. If evening was once only a small circle rather than a long night, then perhaps one of the deepest differences between us and most humans who ever lived is not what we do after dark, but how much darkness is now allowed to belong to us. If fire seems central in this story, it is important to say carefully what that does and does not mean. Fire did not turn night into day. It did not remove the body's limits, erase darkness from the landscape, or give human beings full command over the hours after sunset. That would be too strong, and it would flatten the real shape of the past. A more accurate way to think about it is quieter. Fire extended life, but only a little. It widened the human evening without transforming it into the open, stable nighttime world that many people now take for granted. This distinction matters because the title of the video can easily sound more absolute than the evidence allows. To say that much of human history ended at the fire is not to say that fire solved the problem of night. It is almost the opposite. Fire matters because it shows how limited the solution still was. Near the beginning of our species, when darkness reduced vision, cooled the body, and compressed social life into a smaller zone, fire created an exception to those pressures. But it was a local exception, not a total escape. It gave people more than they would otherwise have had, but much less than a modern evening provides. That may be why it belongs at the center of this question. Fire did not abolish the end of the day. It delayed it. It softened it. It held it back at the edge for a while. And that small delay may have shaped human life more deeply than we often notice. A little more light is not only a practical advantage, it is a little more time to remain socially visible. A little more warmth is not only bodily comfort, it is a little more ability to sit, handle food, care for children, watch older adults, and remain gathered rather than scattering into stillness. A little more predictability in the dark is not the conquest of night. It is simply enough to keep ordinary life from collapsing immediately when the sun is gone. This only a little is the heart of the truck. It reminds us that the old human evening was built on narrow extensions, not on full control. Fire gave continuation, but within limits. It worked only near the source. It had to be maintained. It shifted with wind, fuel, and attention. Its light was uneven. Its warmth faded with distance. Its protection was never universal. Near our long human origin, that would have made the end of the day something people could negotiate but not overcome. They could enlarge the edge of the human world for a while, but not make it permanent. In this sense, fire may have taught one of the oldest lessons in human history. Survival often depended not on erasing a limit, but on slightly extending what the body and the group could still do before the limit returned. That pattern appears again and again in human life. We do not always defeat constraints. Sometimes we gain a little room inside them. Fire at night may have been one of the oldest examples. It gave a small island of continued human presence inside a much larger darkness that remained mostly unchanged. This is also why the title should be heard with restraint rather than drama. Ended at the fire does not mean everything outside the flame became impossible at once. It means that the fire marked the last meaningful extension of a day that could no longer spread very far on purely human terms. Beyond it, visibility, warmth, coordination, and confidence all weakened enough that life narrowed sharply. So the fire was not the opposite of ending, it was the final brief resistance to it. If that is true, then perhaps one of the most revealing facts about early human life is not that fire made people powerful, but that even one of our greatest tools could only give us a little more night before the dark reclaimed the rest. That small extension changed the meaning of evening because even a little added time can reshape how a species lives. Fire did not need to conquer the night in order to matter. It only needed to hold back the collapse of the human world long enough for certain things to continue that otherwise would have narrowed much sooner. This is easy to underestimate from the modern point of view, because we live inside vast nighttime extensions made possible by electricity, buildings, heating, and stable light. We are used to additions so large that they feel normal, but near the beginning of our species, a modest increase in warmth, visibility, and social continuity after sunset would have been profound, precisely because the baseline was so narrow. A little more light can mean the difference between immediate withdrawal and one more interval of shared life. A little more warmth can mean the difference between restless discomfort and tolerable stillness. A little more visibility can mean the difference between a group fading into scattered uncertainty and a group remaining readable to itself. Fire extended life only a little, but the little was real, and it gathered around some of the most important things humans do. It gathered around feeding, because food becomes easier to handle, share, and continue preparing in a lit and warmed space. It gathered around care, because children, injured bodies, and older adults all benefit when the surrounding conditions are less harsh. It gathered around social attention, because expression and gesture return when faces are visible enough to interpret. It gathered around orientation, because people can still judge nearby objects and movements. None of this amounts to a transformed night, yet together it creates something that matters greatly, a final zone in which human life can continue in recognizable form instead of giving way immediately to darkness, cold, and reduced capacity. That may be why the history of fire is so powerful without needing to be exaggerated. It sits exactly at the boundary between enough and not enough. It does not create abundance. It creates margin. And margin for a vulnerable species can be decisive. Near our long origin, early humans did not need a perfect nighttime world in order to benefit from fire. They only needed the day to end less abruptly. They only needed the body to remain functional a little longer, the group to remain gathered a little longer, the visible world to remain legible a little longer. That slight postponement may have altered the emotional texture of evening as well, though we must be careful not to invent feelings we cannot verify. What we can say more safely is that fire likely changed the rhythm of transition. Without it, night would have pressed inward faster. With it, there was an interval of continuation. The day did not vanish all at once. It dimmed into a smaller human center before retreating further. This is one reason the title should not be heard as if the fire were simply the end point. In another sense, it was also the last extension before the end point. A day ended at the fire because the fire was where its final human form persisted. And once that persistence could no longer be maintained, the limits of the body, the environment, and the dark resumed their full force. Seen this way, fire becomes a measure of human limitation rather than a simple symbol of mastery. Its importance lies partly in the fact that it reveals how narrow the bridge really was between day and night. If one of the greatest tools in human history could only widen that bridge by a little, then perhaps the old human evening was even smaller and more fragile than the modern mind easily imagines. This is where the title becomes most precise. Fire did not stand at one end of a dramatic contrast between total helplessness and total control. It stood in the middle, as a modest extension of human possibility. That is why it mattered so deeply. If early humans had been able to keep the day going far beyond sunset by their own bodies alone, then fire would have been helpful but not decisive. If fire had fully transformed night into a stable human environment, then the old limits of darkness would have mattered less. But neither was true. The human body remained limited, the surrounding night remained larger than the circle of light, and the fire remained a partial answer. Its historical power lies in that exact proportion. It gave enough to matter, but not enough to erase the border. Near the long beginning of our species, this may have shaped evening in a very particular way. A group did not simply move from day into night. It moved from open range into narrowing range, and then into a final space where a little more life was still possible. That little more may have included the last handling of food, the last moments of visible care, the last checks of tools or materials, the last quiet exchanges among people whose faces could still be read, the last warmth before sleep or stillness. Fire did not abolish ending, it gave ending a structure. It created a smaller phase between the wide human world of daylight and the much more reduced world that followed when even firelight thinned. This may be why the old evening should not be imagined as either fully active or fully closed. It was suspended. It was a temporary human interval stretched between two conditions: the larger accessibility of day and the deeper constraints of night. Fire held that interval open, but only briefly. This is important because it keeps the video honest. The title does not need the past to be harsher than it was. It only needs us to notice how much of human history was lived under limits we no longer feel directly. The modern mind is surrounded by durable extensions of the day. We live in buildings that hold heat, under lights that do not flicker out with fuel gathered by hand, inside networks of illumination that make night look governable. Against that background, a fire can seem primitive, small, almost symbolic. But for most humans who ever lived, that small thing may have marked the final enlargement of the day, not because it gave them a whole night to command, but because it granted a narrow remaining field where the body, the eye, and the group could still function together. Once we see that, the meaning of only a little grows larger rather than smaller. A little warmth, a little light, a little readable space, a little more time in one another's presence. These are not trivial gains when the alternative is a faster collapse of usable life after sunset. In fact, the modesty of the gain may be what makes it so historically revealing. It shows how close most human evenings remain to the edge of what the body and environment would allow. Fire mattered because the margin mattered, and for most of our history, much of life may have depended on margins rather than abundance. So perhaps the most truthful way to understand the old human evening is this: the fire was not where people defeated the night, and not even where they fully escaped it. It was where they held on to the day for a little longer, long enough for the human world to remain itself before the dark took back what the flame could no longer keep. When we speak about ancient nights and ancient fires, it becomes especially important to slow down and ask what the evidence can truly support. Fire feels central to the human story, and there are strong reasons for that. Archaeology has found repeated traces of burning, hearth-like features, ash deposits, heat-altered stone, and bones or sediments affected by fire in a wide range of sites. These traces matter because they show that fire was not a rare curiosity added at the edges of life. In many places, across very long spans of time, it appears as part of the organized space of human occupation. But archaeology also teaches restraint. It can often show that fire was present. It can sometimes show where it was maintained, how often a place may have been used, and how closely fire was tied to food processing, shelter, or repeated habitation. What it cannot usually do is give us a full sensory record of the evening itself. It cannot tell us exactly what every person felt as darkness fell. It cannot tell us the precise rhythm of each night, or how long people spoke, or whether a given silence was peaceful, tired, fearful, or ordinary. This is the honest difficulty at the center of the Truk. To understand why much of human history may have ended at the fire, we need archaeology. But archaeology does not give us a complete night. It gives us fragments strong enough to guide thought, and incomplete enough to keep us careful. Near the long beginning of our species, that balance matters. The evidence for human interaction with fire across prehistory is important, but not simple. Some sites preserve clear signs of burning in contexts associated with human activity. Some show repeated use of the same spaces, suggesting that fire was not random but managed. In caves, rock shelters, and open-air sites, the placement of burned materials can hint at centers of occupation and the organization of living space. This allows a grounded inference. Fire was often part of how humans made certain places usable. It helped structure where bodies gathered, where food may have been processed, and where activity could continue under conditions that would otherwise narrow sharply after sunset. That is already a powerful conclusion, and we do not need to go beyond it recklessly. Archaeology becomes most valuable here when it helps us see patterns without pretending to see everything. A hearth can suggest a center. Burned bone can suggest cooking or repeated fire use. Ash layers can suggest continuity through time. Clusters of materials around a fire feature can suggest that human activity was drawn inward around heat and light. But even these findings have limits. Preservation is uneven. Fire traces can be disturbed. Natural burning and human-controlled burning are not always easy to separate in every context. Dates can be debated. Interpretations can shift as methods improve. And the farther back we go, the more careful we must be, not to turn partial evidence into complete scenes. So this truck is not here to weaken the video's argument. It is here to make it trustworthy. The point is not that archaeology proves every detail of the ancient evening. The point is that it shows enough to support a careful picture. Fire was materially central in many human settings, and that centrality likely mattered even more once daylight faded and the human world shrank. Near the origin of our species, the physical traces left in earth and stone cannot tell us everything that happened around a flame, but they can tell us that flame repeatedly occupied the kinds of places where human life organized itself. And if archaeology keeps finding those centers, while also reminding us how much remains unknowable, then perhaps the most honest way forward is this: to ask not for fantasy about the night, but for a disciplined imagination grounded in what the ashes actually left behind. One of the clearest things archaeology can do is show that fire was often not scattered randomly through human sites. It tends to appear in ways that suggest organization. Burned areas, ash concentrations, heat-altered stone, and repeated traces in the same parts of a shelter or occupation surface can imply that some spaces were used again and again as centers of activity. This matters because it moves fire out of the category of occasional accident and into the category of structured human life. A fire that leaves repeated traces in the same kind of place is not only a flame, it is part of how a group arranged bodies, objects, tasks, and time. For the question in this video, that is highly important. If much of human history ended at the fire, we would expect fire not merely to appear in archaeological sites, but to appear in ways that suggest centrality, and very often that is what makes these traces so meaningful. Still, the evidence must be handled with patience. Archaeology does not give us a continuous recording of ancient evenings. It gives us preserved outcomes of material processes. A patch of ash is not a spoken memory. A burned bone is not a full story. A hearth-like feature is not a complete social scene. These remains tell us that fire was there, that matter was transformed by heat, that space may have been reused, and that human presence often clustered around these altered zones. But they do not directly reveal the exact sequence of behavior that unfolded hour by hour. We cannot watch people move inward toward the light. We cannot hear what was said. We cannot measure precisely how long a given evening remained active before bodies settled into rest. This limit is not a failure of archaeology. It is simply the nature of evidence that survives across deep time. Near the beginning of our species, where written records do not exist and direct observation is impossible, even partial material traces become extremely valuable. They allow us to reconstruct patterns, though not private experience. If several kinds of evidence point in the same direction, a careful picture becomes possible. Fire repeatedly appears in human contexts. Human occupations often seem organized around it. Heat affects stone, bone, and sediments in recognizable ways. Repeated burning can help mark places of return, not just one-time use. From this, we can infer something modest but important. Fire likely served as a recurring center of human activity, especially when the environment made warmth, light, and a stable focal point useful. That inference becomes even more meaningful when connected to everything else we know about the human body and darkness. Humans rely heavily on sight, social coordination, and tolerable thermal conditions. Night reduces all three, so when archaeology shows recurring centers of fire use, it aligns with a broader biological and environmental logic. The material traces do not stand alone, they fit a larger pattern. This is where the argument becomes strong without becoming reckless. We do not need to claim that every fire feature was the emotional heart of a group, or that every night unfolded in the same way. We only need to recognize that the repeated material centrality of fire is exactly what we would expect if the human world often contracted around it after sunset. In that sense, archaeology gives us something deeply valuable. It does not let us invent the ancient night, but it prevents us from treating it as pure mystery. It shows that the places where humans left durable signs of occupation were often also places marked by heat, burning, and repeated use of flame. And if the ground itself keeps preserving that pattern, then perhaps the ancient evening left behind one quiet message in ash and stone. When the wider world became harder to inhabit, people returned again and again to the place where light, warmth, and human order could still be held together for a little longer. Archaeology becomes most trustworthy when it also teaches us where not to go. That may sound like a limitation, but it is actually part of its strength. The farther back we look, the easier it is to turn a few solid traces into a complete imagined world. A hearth becomes a family scene. Burned bone becomes a full meal. Ash becomes a whole evening of conversation, care, and rest. Some of those reconstructions may be partly reasonable, but the evidence itself does not contain that much detail. What it gives us are durable signs that heat was present, that certain places were used repeatedly, and that human occupation often gathered around these transformed spaces. That is enough to say something important. It is not enough to say everything. For a video like this, that difference matters. If the goal is to remain truthful, then the ancient night has to stay partly unknown. Near the long beginning of our species, we can often identify that fire was used, that it mattered, and that it likely helped organize space. But we cannot pretend to know the full inner life of the people around it. We cannot safely assign them modern feelings, fully detailed routines, or identical behaviors across continents and thousands of generations. The evidence does not support that kind of certainty. What it does support is narrower, but still powerful. Fire repeatedly appears as part of human environments. It leaves material centers. It alters bone, stone, soil, and shelter surfaces. It tends to show up in places where bodies returned, and where activity was not purely accidental. In some cases, the spatial patterning of remains suggests that the areas around fire were meaningful zones within occupation sites. This matters because it fits the larger argument of the video without forcing it beyond the evidence. If much of human history ended at the fire, archaeology does not prove the sentence word for word, but it does preserve one of its most important foundations. Fire was materially central often enough, and in enough contexts that it likely played a deep role in how human presence held itself together after sunset. The honest way to use archaeology, then, is not to ask it for dramatic scenes, but to let it define the boundary between knowledge and speculation. That boundary is part of the story. It reminds us that ancient life was real without becoming fully transparent to us. It also protects the deeper point from exaggeration. We do not need to claim that every prehistoric group feared the dark in the same way, or that every evening followed one script. We only need to recognize that human beings lived for immense stretches of time in conditions where darkness reduced vision, warmth, mobility, and coordinated activity, and that the archaeological record repeatedly preserves fire near the center of spaces humans used. That combination is already enough to justify a careful conclusion. The fire was not only useful in a general sense, it was often located where human life condensed into durable form. Near our species' origin, that may have made it one of the clearest physical anchors of the evening world. The rest remains partly hidden, and perhaps it should. History that reaches this far back does not owe us complete pictures. It offers fragments, and asks us to think with discipline. So maybe the most truthful gift archaeology gives this question is not a perfect reconstruction of the night, but a measured confidence. Enough ash, enough burned stone, enough repeated centers of heat to show where the human world often gathered, and enough silence around those traces to remind us how much of the old darkness can still only be approached, never fully entered. Fire changed food long before it changed history in any written sense. It changed food before records, before cities, before kitchens, before recipes were fixed in text. And because food is never only food in human life, that change likely reached far beyond the meal itself. It reached into time, into the body, into group rhythm, and into the meaning of the day's end. This is why the question of fire and food belongs in this video. If much of human history ended at the fire, then one reason may be simple and profound at once. The fire was not only where people stayed warm after sunset, it was also where raw matter was being turned into something more usable by the human body. That alone would have made the evening different. A fire that helps transform food does more than illuminate the last hours of the day. It gives those hours a purpose that daylight alone did not complete. Near the beginning of our species, we should be careful not to imagine identical meals or a single universal routine. Early humans lived in different landscapes, found different plants and animals, and used different kinds of shelter and tools. But across that variation, one broad point is widely accepted and deeply important. Controlled fire changed what humans could do with food. It could make some foods softer, warmer, safer, easier to chew, or easier to digest than they would be in raw form. That does not mean every group cooked everything, or that every benefit was identical everywhere. It means fire likely altered the relationship between food and the body in ways that mattered enough to shape daily life. Once that becomes true, the end of the day changes as well. Food preparation is not just a technical act. It organizes time. It creates a point of return. It gives the evening a center around which bodies gather and wait, handle, watch, share, or continue working with what the day brought in. This may have made the fire a place where the day did not simply stop, but where its scattered efforts were drawn back together into something the group could finally use. Daylight may have been the time of movement, searching, collecting, tracking, carrying, or processing. Fire then became the place where some of those efforts reached completion. In that sense, the fire was not only the end of action, it was where action was converted into nourishment. That matters because nourishment changes the body's relationship to night. A body that has eaten more effectively can settle differently into rest. A group that has shared processed food can remain together under more stable conditions. Children, older adults, and injured people may benefit especially when food is warmer, softer, or more manageable. Again, we should not overstate certainty where evidence is uneven, but the broad logic is strong. If fire changed food, and food changed what the body could tolerate and use, then the fire also changed how the day could close. It gave the evening a final practical task that fit perfectly with the narrowing world after sunset. The group did not have to move widely anymore. It could gather inward, hands could work close to the light, eyes could stay on nearby objects. Heat could support both the body and the meal. This may be one reason the old human evening was so often organized around flame. Not because food alone explains everything, but because food, warmth, visibility, and social nearness all converged there at once. The fire became the place where the body could still be prepared for the night even as the world outside became less available. And if so much of early human life depended on turning the day's effort into something the body could actually use, then perhaps the evening did not merely end at the fire. Perhaps it was completed there. Cooking does not only change food chemically or physically, it changes sequence. It changes when a day feels finished. In a world where much of human activity depended on daylight, the transformation of food by fire may have given evening one of its clearest final purposes. What had been gathered, cut, carried, or protected during the day could now be brought into a smaller zone and worked on near warmth and light. The body no longer moved outward into the landscape. Instead, the products of that landscape were pulled inward toward the group. This is one reason fire belongs so naturally at the center of the title. It was not only a defense against darkness, it was one of the places where the scattered labor of daylight became usable life. Near the beginning of our species, before modern storage, stable indoor lighting, and insulated domestic space, that conversion may have mattered immensely. A meal is never just calories arriving in a body. It also marks a transition. It tells a group that movement is slowing, that immediate searching may be over, that attention is returning from the wider environment to the needs of those gathered close. If food is being warmed, softened, or made easier to handle by fire, then the fire becomes part of that transition. It does not simply stand beside the evening. It helps produce the evening as a recognizable human phase. This becomes easier to see when we think about scale. Daytime life can spread across terrain. People can move, separate, scan, search, and act over distance. Food work near a fire is different. It compresses action. Hands come closer to what they are doing. Eyes focus on nearby surfaces. Bodies stay within reach of heat. Others can watch, wait, assist, or simply remain present. The fire thus changes not only the food, but the geometry of social life. It gathers people into a setting where bodily need and social closeness are tied together. That may have been one of the most ordinary structures of the old human evening. Not a dramatic ritual every time, and not identical across all places, but a repeated convergence of nourishment, warmth, and reduced space. This matters for the question of why human history may have ended at the fire. The answer is not simply that the dark forced people inward. It is also that the inward place offered something essential in return. It gave a body preparation for the hours ahead. It gave the group a final practical task around which presence still made sense. It gave a form to the evening that was more than passive waiting for sleep. Fire could still be a site of completion. The day's efforts reached the body there. The outside world became food there. The raw became more usable there. And because these changes were happening just as visibility, temperature, and mobility were all narrowing, the fire became the place where many pressures of human life met. We should remain careful, as always, not to force one universal scene onto all prehistory. Some meals may have been simple. Some evenings may have involved little preparation. Some settings may have offered different possibilities, depending on climate, shelter, materials, and season. But the broad pattern remains persuasive and grounded. If fire made food more manageable, and if that food supported bodies entering the cold and dark portion of the daily cycle, then evening near the fire was not an accident of comfort. It was one of the practical ways human life was stabilized at the edge of night. In that sense, the fire did not merely extend the day by giving light. It extended the day by allowing the body to receive its final share of the day's labor in a form it could better use. And if that process kept repeating across immense stretches of time, then perhaps one of the oldest meanings of evening was this quiet conversion. The world outside growing darker, while the day's gathered matter was turned, beside the flame, into something the human body could carry into the night. Food also changes the meaning of gathering. A fire without food can still offer warmth and visibility, but a fire connected to eating becomes something more complete. It becomes a place where the needs of the body, the timing of the group, and the narrowing of the world after sunset all meet in one point. This may be one of the reasons fire held such a steady place in human life for so long. It did not serve one function at the end of the day. It joined several functions that were all becoming more urgent at once. As light faded and movement across land became less practical, the body still needed care. It still needed energy, heat, softness, and a tolerable path into rest. Food prepared or improved by fire helped provide that path, and because it did so in a shared place, it also shaped how evening felt as a human event rather than a merely biological one. Near the beginning of our species, this would have mattered deeply, even if it looked different from one setting to another. The old human evening was not broad enough to support endless scattered activity. It was often compressed into a smaller field where things had to justify their place. Food naturally belonged there because it answered immediate needs while fitting the reduced scale of night. A meal near a fire does not require the whole landscape. It requires closeness, attention, hands, heat, and the presence of others. It is almost perfectly suited to an evening world that has already contracted inward. This helps explain why the end of the day may have felt less like a sudden stop, and more like a drawing together. What had been separate under daylight could converge beside the flame. Bodies returned, effort returned, materials returned, hunger returned in a form that could now be answered. Fire was where that answer became possible, not fully, not identically in every place, and not with modern abundance, but enough to matter across generations. Once again, the truth here is strongest when kept modest. We do not need to claim that every evening meal created harmony, or that all food preparation happened in the same way. Archaeology and comparative reasoning allow only a careful picture, yet the broad structure remains persuasive. Fire changed what food could become, and food changed what evening could support. A body that can take in warmth and more manageable nourishment does not simply survive better in the abstract. It enters the night differently. A group that gathers around shared food does not simply remain close by chance. It occupies a final zone of coordinated life, while the world outside becomes harder to use. In this way, food helps reveal why the fire was so often the place where the day reached its last human form. It was not just the last light, it was the last transformation. The raw results of daylight labor were altered there into something the body could carry inward. And that inward movement may be one of the oldest rhythms in our history, outward into the world to find, gather, carry, and endure, inward toward the fire, to soften, share, consume, and settle. If that rhythm repeated across most of the human past, then the title begins to sound less like an image and more like a structure. Human history ended at the fire not only because light failed beyond it, but because the body itself still had one final need to meet there. The day may have closed where food became usable, where warmth became local, and where the group became small enough to remain human together for a little while longer before the night asked even more of them. A human group is never made of one kind of body. That fact matters more at night. In daylight, differences between bodies can be partly managed by movement, visibility, distance, and time. The stronger can carry more, the quicker can range farther, the more capable can watch, return, and assist. But after sunset, when the world narrows, those differences press inward. The question is no longer only what one healthy adult can do. It becomes what a whole mixed group can still sustain together. Children, older adults, injured people, the tired, the ill, and those carrying the weight of care all pull the logic of evening toward a centre. And in much of human history, that centre was often the fire. This is one of the deepest reasons the title matters. To say that human history ended at the fire is not only to describe a limit imposed by darkness on strong bodies moving through open land, it is also to describe the way a group becomes more inward when its most vulnerable members must be kept within warmth, light, and immediate reach. Near the beginning of our species, before durable nighttime environments made evening more spacious, this would have been a basic fact of life. Human groups were not collections of equal bodies facing the night under identical terms. They were mixed communities of dependency, competence, age, and need. A child does not meet the dark as an adult does. An older body may not tolerate cold as well. An injured person may not move with confidence on uncertain ground. A caregiver may be bound not to personal preference, but to whoever must be watched, fed, calmed, or kept near. Once we place these realities into the story, the old evening changes shape. It is no longer just a narrowing of space around light. It is also a gathering of generations into the only zone where a group can remain together without abandoning those who cannot easily manage the night on their own. This is why fire should not be imagined merely as a survival tool for isolated individuals. It functioned within a social world where weakness, age, and dependence were always present. Around a source of light and warmth, smaller bodies could be monitored more easily. Older adults could remain in tolerable conditions. Injury could be noticed. Discomfort could be answered more quickly. Food, once processed or softened by heat, could be given in ways that better matched different bodies and different stages of life. The fire thus became more than the edge of the visible world. It became a point where the group's internal responsibilities could still be met after darkness had taken away much of the wider environment. This matters because human history is not the history of the strongest members only. It is the history of groups that had to carry infancy, age, weakness, recovery, and interdependence through time. Near our species' long origin, that interdependence was not a secondary feature of life. It was life. A group that could not gather its vulnerable inward as evening fell would face a different and harsher night than a group that could. Fire helped make that inward gathering possible. It created a local world where different generations could remain within one another's reach even as the land outside became less usable. That does not mean every evening was gentle, or every group equally protected, or every landscape equally manageable, but it does suggest something broad and important. The end of the day may have often been structured not just by darkness itself, but by the needs of those least able to meet darkness alone. And if so, then perhaps the fire was not only where the day stopped for humans in general, it was where the group made room, in its final small circle, for every age the night would treat differently. A child changes the shape of evening, even in the modern world. A tired child must be carried, warmed, fed, watched, and settled. An older person may need slower movement, more stable heat, more predictable surroundings, and quicker response if discomfort appears. An injured body narrows the options of everyone nearby. Once we remember this, the title of the video becomes less abstract and more human. Much of history may have ended at the fire not simply because darkness limited the strong, but because darkness made care itself more local. A mixed human group could not move through the night on the terms of its most capable members alone. It had to contract around the needs of those who required nearness most. Near the beginning of our species, Long before modern shelters, indoor heating, stable lighting, and medicine changed the conditions of care, this would have mattered constantly. Human groups likely contained a wide range of bodies with different tolerances, strengths, and risks. Some could still move with confidence after sunset for a short time, others could not. Some could endure cooling air more easily, others would be affected sooner. Some could wait through discomfort, others needed immediate help. That variation may have drawn evening inward, with a force almost as important as darkness itself. A group does not remain spread out for long when some of its members must be kept warm, visible, fed, and within reach. The fire answered many of these needs at once. It did not solve them perfectly, but it concentrated the conditions under which care could still happen. Light made faces readable. Warmth reduced bodily strain. Proximity made response faster. Food prepared near heat could be easier for different bodies to manage. A child waking in distress, an elder losing warmth, an injured person needing attention, a caregiver balancing exhaustion with responsibility, none of these require dramatic danger to reshape the night. They only require a world in which distance and darkness make care more costly. Fire lowered that cost within a small zone. That may be why evening was so often not just a retreat from the outside world, but a gathering into responsibility. The group drew inward not merely to survive the dark, but to remain capable of meeting one another's needs inside it. This is one of the clearest ways the structure of human life differs from the life of many other animals. We do not only pass genes forward through reproduction, we pass life forward through prolonged care, shared labor, and attention distributed across unequal bodies. Human history is full of dependency. Childhood is long. Recovery can be slow. Age changes movement and tolerance. Illness interrupts capacity. Caregiving redirects time and energy. Near our long origin, these realities would not have disappeared when the sun went down. If anything, the loss of visibility and warmth would have made them more central. The old evening then may have been shaped not only by what adults could still do, but by what the group could not afford to neglect. That helps us hear the title differently. Ended at the fire can sound at first like a sentence about limitation alone, but it may also be a sentence about obligation. The day ended there because the circle of fire was where a mixed community could still remain a community. It was where those who needed more support could still be included in the final usable space of the day. It was where the stronger stayed near the weaker because the surrounding world had become harder for all, and hardest of all for those least able to manage it unaided. If so, then the fire was not only the edge of the human world against darkness, it was also the place where human interdependence became most visible. What the fire gathered, in the end, was not only warmth or visibility, but generations. That may be one of the quietest truths in the whole story. A human evening was never just an encounter between darkness and a single adult body. It was an encounter between darkness and a layered community. Children still growing, adults carrying work and care, elders carrying age, and others moving through illness, fatigue, recovery, or temporary weakness. Once we see that clearly, the old evening looks different. It becomes less a simple reduction of light, and more a compression of the whole social body into the smallest place where every age could still remain inside shared attention. This may be why the fire belongs so naturally at the center of the title. It was not only where activity narrowed, it was where generations could still fit together when the outside world no longer easily allowed it. Near the beginning of our species, before durable nighttime spaces made the evening broad and protected, this compression may have shaped the daily rhythm of human life more deeply than we often realize. Daylight allowed differences in capacity to spread out across space. The stronger could range farther, the more mobile could do more before returning. But after dark, those differences no longer organized the group in the same way. Night equalized some limits while intensifying others. Everyone lost visibility. Everyone faced cooler air. Everyone entered a world with less room for error. Yet the consequences were still uneven. The smallest and oldest bodies would often feel the narrowing sooner. Those responsible for care could not move as if alone. The entire group, in a sense, had to descend toward the pace and needs of its more vulnerable members. Fire made that descent possible without turning it into immediate collapse. It created a small but meaningful zone where generations could remain together under conditions the body could better tolerate. This may also be one reason the end of the day should not be imagined only as retreat. It was also a reassembly. Day scattered effort across land. Evening brought that effort back toward the people who needed one another most directly. A child could be fed and watched. An older person could remain within warmth. A tired adult could still respond to someone nearby because distance had been reduced. The group became smaller in space, but perhaps more concentrated in responsibility. And that concentration may have been one of the oldest human patterns of all. Long before history was written, life likely depended again and again on the ability to compress care into a workable circle before the conditions of night became too costly. This does not mean every evening was gentle, orderly, or secure. Human life has always included strain, loss, conflict, and variation. Different climates, shelters, seasons, and group sizes would have changed everything, but the broad structure remains persuasive and careful. Fire offered a place where multiple generations and unequal bodies could still be held within one manageable environment after sunset. In that sense, it did not just mark the end of activity, it marked the last place where the human group in all its unevenness could continue as a group. That may be the deepest answer hidden in this truk. The day ended at the fire not only because darkness narrowed the world, but because the surviving piece of world had to be large enough to contain dependence itself. And perhaps that is what made the fire so central across so much of the human past. It was one of the few places where strength, weakness, age, need, and care could all still remain visible to one another before the night grew larger than all of them. The world outside the fire did not need to be full of immediate attack in order to feel costly. That is one of the most important things to understand about ancient night. When modern people imagine the deep past, they often picture darkness as a theatre of constant danger, as if every step beyond the flame meant certain disaster. That is too simple, and it is not necessary to make the real point. The pressure outside the light was often quieter than that. It came from cold air, uncertain ground, reduced visibility, separation from the group, and the simple fact that a human body moves less confidently when the surrounding world can no longer be read well. Predators may have mattered in some places and times, certainly, but they were only one part of a larger pattern. The night pressed on human life because beyond the fire, the terms of existence became harder. Near the beginning of our species, this pressure would have been deeply familiar. During daylight, land could be judged at a distance, a path could be followed, a change in terrain could be noticed early. The group could spread out and still remain connected through sight and movement. But after sunset, that same environment changed character. The ground did not become different in itself, yet it became different for the human body. A dip in the earth, a branch, loose stone, wet surface, or unseen obstacle could matter more when visibility had narrowed. A sound from farther off could no longer be matched to a clear image. A movement at the edge of perception could carry uncertainty beyond its actual threat. In such a world, even without any direct encounter, the cost of being outside the circle of light rose steadily. This is where cold enters the story as a kind of silent pressure. Darkness and temperature often work together. When light disappears, the body does not only lose information, it begins to lose comfort and, in some conditions, heat. That makes lingering outside the fire less attractive and sometimes less tolerable. A group does not need to be chased inward for the night to gather around warmth. It only needs the surrounding air to become less forgiving, and the body to know, through repeated experience, that exposure becomes more expensive after dark. In that sense, the pressure outside the light was not always dramatic, but it was persistent. It encouraged caution. It rewarded nearness. It made the fire not just a preference, but often the most reasonable center of remaining life. Predators belong in this picture, but carefully. Early humans lived across many landscapes, and the kinds of risk they faced would have varied greatly by region, season, and time period. We should not imagine a single universal night of fear. Yet it is widely reasonable to say that darkness made it harder to detect, interpret, and respond to other animals, just as it made many other features of the world harder to manage. For a species whose strength relied so much on seeing, coordinating, and acting together, that uncertainty alone would matter. The issue is not that every night brought a predator close to the fire. The issue is that the world beyond the fire allowed less knowledge and therefore less control. That is enough to change behavior across generations. This is why the old human evening may have tightened around fire again and again. Outside the light, cold could intensify, footing could worsen, distance could become unreadable, and the possibility of unseen life in the dark remained unresolved. Inside it, at least a small part of the world stayed interpretable. The body could remain warmer. Others could still be seen. Movement, though reduced, could still be meaningful and shared. If that contrast repeated across most of human history, then perhaps the fire did not need to keep every danger away. It only needed to mark the place where the world was still manageable enough for human life to continue. Cold has a special place in this story because it does not always arrive as an emergency. Often, it arrives as subtraction. It takes ease from the body bit by bit. Fingers become less precise. Stillness becomes harder to enjoy. Muscles tighten. The wish to move competes with the wish to preserve warmth. A person does not need to be freezing for the night to begin narrowing around heat. It is enough that the body gradually stops wanting to spend itself in the open air. For much of human history, that quiet pressure may have mattered every bit as much as the more dramatic risks we tend to imagine. If the world beyond the fire became colder, darker, and less readable all at once, then the centre of evening would not need to be enforced. It would emerge naturally from the body's own arithmetic. Near the beginning of our species, this would have shaped human behaviour in deeply ordinary ways. A person outside the circle of warmth would not only see less, that person would have fewer reasons to remain there unless some need outweighed the cost. The fire changed that balance. It gave the body a place where exposure was reduced, where hands could still function with more control, where waiting was more tolerable, and where the slow loss of comfort did not push every member of the group toward immediate withdrawal. This is why warmth and visibility should be thought of together. Light helped the eye, but heat helped the body remain willing to stay present in the same place. Without that combination, the usable evening would have shrunk faster. Ground also matters more than it first appears. In daylight, uneven land can often be managed through anticipation. The eye reads texture, slope, obstacles, and distance before the foot commits. At night, even familiar terrain changes because less of it can be judged in advance. The body becomes more cautious, not because the world has become actively hostile, but because the margin for small mistakes narrows. A misstep on loose earth, a hidden branch, a patch of damp ground, a sudden drop in footing. None of these needs to be severe in isolation to influence behaviour across thousands of nights. Human beings learn from repeated cost. If moving away from warmth and light tends to bring more uncertainty and more bodily strain, then the group will repeatedly fold inward. That is how pressure outside the light works. It does not always force, it often persuades. Predators fit into this picture most honestly when they are treated as part of uncertainty rather than as a constant cinematic threat. In some environments and time periods, the possibility of dangerous animals would certainly have shaped nighttime caution. But even when no predator was near, darkness itself made it harder to know what was near. For a species whose strengths depended on reading the environment clearly and responding together, that loss of knowledge mattered. Sound without sight can hold attention in a different way. Movement half seen can change the body's posture. Uncertainty can keep people near one another even when nothing happens. Fire answered this not by eliminating the outer world, but by creating a smaller inner one where the terms of life were better. The ground immediately nearby could be monitored. Other bodies could be seen. Small disturbances could be interpreted collectively. The air was more tolerable. In that sense, the fire did not stand against one danger. It stood against accumulation. Cold, darkness, uncertain footing, unclear sounds, reduced distance judgment, and the unresolved presence of whatever else shared the night all came together outside the light. Inside it, those pressures were not gone, but reduced enough for human life to remain organized. And if that pattern held across most of our past, then perhaps the real force outside the fire was not fear alone, but the steady build-up of costs that made the human world contract night after night toward the place where those costs were lowest. What mattered most about the space beyond the fire may have been that it remained unresolved. In daylight, much of the world can be checked, judged, and corrected. A person sees what is there, estimates distance, notices movement, reads the ground, and adjusts before a problem becomes immediate. At night, that relationship changes. The body does not stop functioning, but it stops knowing enough. And for a species like ours, that loss of knowledge may be one of the deepest pressures the dark creates. Humans are not strongest when they are simply enduring. They are strongest when they can interpret. They succeed by reading the environment, sharing information, and coordinating action before danger or difficulty fully arrives. Once darkness weakens those abilities, the world outside the light becomes not necessarily hostile, but unfinished. It cannot be known in the same stable way. That alone is enough to pull human life inward. Near the beginning of our species, this unresolved quality of night would likely have shaped evening, again and again. The fire did not remove uncertainty from the whole landscape. It only made a small area less uncertain. Inside that area, people could still see one another. The immediate ground could still be judged. Nearby objects could still be handled. Sounds could still be interpreted with reference to visible faces, gestures, and shared attention. Beyond that area, the world remained present but less legible. A sound might be harmless, or it might matter. A movement might be wind, another animal, or nothing important at all. A short walk might be manageable, or it might bring cold, confusion of footing, and temporary separation from the group. What matters is not that every possibility was dangerous. What matters is that too many possibilities could not be sorted clearly enough. This is one reason the title points towards something larger than fear. The day may have ended at the fire because the fire marked the last place where uncertainty had been reduced enough for ordinary life to continue. That ordinary life could include eating, watching, speaking, resting, tending to others, or simply remaining together in a world that still felt partly knowable. Outside the circle, even when nothing threatened directly, the body and the group had less reason to extend themselves. The cost of not knowing rose as light and warmth fell. This helps explain why the evening may have narrowed so consistently across human history. Not because all night was terror, and not because every step beyond the flame meant disaster, but because the human species depends heavily on manageable information. We live well in worlds we can read. We contract in worlds we cannot. Fire became central because it preserved a small, readable world after the larger one had slipped away. That may also be why the old human evening should be imagined less as a confrontation and more as a boundary of competence. Beyond the fire, people did not necessarily face an enemy. They faced reduced command over conditions. The body cooled faster. The ground spoke less clearly to the foot. Distance lost meaning. Other life in the dark could not be fully interpreted. The group's shared intelligence weakened with every step outward. Fire reduced these losses just enough to hold a human center together. In that sense, the pressure outside the light was not only environmental, it was cognitive and social as well. It pressed on the body, on movement, on judgment, and on the group's ability to remain collectively aware. If that pressure returned night after night for most of our past, then perhaps the deepest meaning of the fire was this. It was where the world remained knowable enough for human beings to stay human together a little longer before the dark became too wide to read. Most nights in human history left almost nothing behind. No written record, no name, no date, no memorable event, no monument, no witness beyond those who were there. They passed in the same way weather passes over a landscape, repeated so many times that repetition itself became invisible. This may be one of the hardest things for the modern mind to feel. We are used to history as a chain of notable moments, preserved in documents, stories, and images, but most human time did not look like that. Most human time was made of ordinary cycles, daylight opening the world, evening narrowing it, bodies drawing inward, the fire holding a center, and darkness gradually taking back what the flame could no longer keep. If this video asks why much of human history ended at the fire, then one answer may be that the end of the day happened so often and so similarly that it almost disappeared from history altogether. Near the beginning of our species, long before written memory, the night would have arrived not as a historical event, but as a condition. It came again and again, across generations that left little trace except tools, bones, altered landscapes, and the scattered material signs of occupation. Yet the repetition itself may have been one of the deepest structures of human life. The day spread people outward into movement, searching, carrying, observing, and acting across land. The evening drew that activity back toward a smaller centre where warmth, food, visibility, and nearness could still be maintained. Then night deepened, and much of what had remained possible withdrew further. This sequence may have happened not hundreds or thousands of times, but across an almost unimaginable number of human evenings, and yet very few of those evenings entered what we now call history. That is what makes this truk important. It asks us to think about scale differently. History is often narrated through the exceptional, but species life is shaped just as much by the repeated. The fire may have mattered not because one dramatic night changed everything, but because countless undramatic nights repeated the same narrowing pattern until that pattern became part of what human life was. Children grew up inside it. Adults organized effort around it. Elders aged inside it. Bodies learned it. Groups depended on it. And because it was ordinary, it rarely announced itself. It simply happened. This also helps explain why the title sounds unusual to modern ears. We are not used to thinking of ordinary evenings as historical forces, but if an evening structure repeats for most of the lifespan of a species, then it becomes more than background. It becomes one of the silent conditions under which thought, care, dependence, rest, and social life all take shape. Near our long origin, the fire was not always the subject of human life. Often, it may have been simply the place where life continued in reduced form after daylight ended. Yet that humble role may have made it historically larger than many events that leave clearer records. Some nights may have contained talk, some quiet work, some silence, some tension, some routine care, some simple waiting for sleep. We should not pretend to know their details, but we can say something steadier than detail. Most of them were not preserved. Most of them vanished except for whatever small material traces they left. And still, those vanished nights may have formed one of the strongest repeating patterns in the human past. If so, then history did not only happen in battles, migrations, inventions, and states. It also happened in the nightly return to a shrinking circle, where the human world remained briefly intact. And perhaps that is why the fire deserves such a central place in this story. Not because it belonged to rare moments, but because it belonged to so many ordinary ones that history itself almost forgot to notice them. What disappears most easily from history is not always what mattered least. Often it is what happened too often to be recorded. A single unusual night might survive in memory if something broke, attacked, burned, or changed. But the countless nights when nothing exceptional occurred usually leave almost no voice behind. This is true even in later literate societies, and it would have been even more true across the vast reaches of prehistory. Most evenings did not become stories. They became habit. They became rhythm. They became the unnoticed pattern through which bodies and groups adjusted themselves to the limits of darkness over and over again. That may be why the title of this video sounds strange at first. We are trained to think history is made of the remarkable, but much of human life has always been shaped by the repeatable, the ordinary, and the nearly invisible. Near the beginning of our species, that ordinary structure may have looked something like this. Daylight opens the world and scatters effort across it. Evening gathers effort back inward. The fire becomes the final place where warmth, light, food, care, and social visibility can still meet. Then the night beyond that centre grows larger than the human world can easily manage. Nothing in that pattern needs to be dramatic to be historically important. In fact, its very quietness may be the reason it lasted so long. A repeated condition does not need to surprise anyone in order to shape them. It only needs to return often enough that life bends around it. The old human evening may have done exactly that. It taught bodies when to stop ranging outward. It taught groups where to compress care. It taught effort to return to a centre before darkness made the outer world too costly. It taught generations that the usable day had an edge, and that edge was often marked by flame. This is where the scale of the story becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind. We are not speaking of a few cultures or a few centuries. We are speaking of most of the time our species has existed. Across that immense stretch, night after night would have ended not in the bright continuity familiar to modern people, but in some form of contraction. Even where conditions differed widely, and even where evenings varied in mood, climate, shelter, and routine, the broad pattern likely remained. After sunset, the human world did not stay large for very long. It became local. It became concentrated. It became dependent on small, maintained islands of order. Fire was among the oldest of those islands. This matters because repetition shapes expectation, and expectation shapes culture, even when no one writes it down. Children learn what ordinary life feels like not by hearing abstract principles, but by living inside recurring structures. If evening repeatedly means gathering inward, watching the light, tending warmth, finishing food, keeping the vulnerable close, and accepting that the outer world is mostly done for the day, then that pattern becomes part of what life is. It becomes one of the silent architectures of being human. We do not need to claim that every group experienced this in the same emotional way. We do not need to invent identical scenes across all landscapes and times. It is enough to recognize that a repeated environmental and bodily limit can become historically formative, even when it leaves only faint material traces. That is the true subject of this truk. Most nights left no history behind in the usual sense, but they may have created history in a deeper one. They formed habits of gathering, limits of movement, rhythms of care, and expectations about where the day ended. And because they were ordinary, they disappeared into the background of the human story. Yet perhaps it is exactly there, in the background, that some of the oldest truths of our species were built, not in rare events under bright light, but in the countless evenings when people returned once more to the small place where the day could still remain human before the darkness took the rest. There is a quiet consequence to all this repetition. When something happens almost every night for most of a species' existence, it begins to shape not only behavior, but the scale at which life is imagined. The modern mind often assumes that a day naturally expands until sleep interrupts it, but for most humans who ever lived, the day may have been imagined in a narrower way without anyone needing to explain it. Its ending was not merely a private decision. It was built into the body, the environment, the group, and the small material center that could still hold them together after sunset. That center was often fire. And because this pattern repeated so often, it may have become one of the least visible and most powerful structures in human history. Near the beginning of our species, nothing about this would have seemed unusual. That may be the most important point. The shrinking of evening toward light and warmth was likely not experienced as a historical condition in need of explanation. It was simply how life moved. The world opened, then narrowed. Effort spread out, then returned. Bodies became less adventurous, more careful, more local. The group condensed around the place where food, warmth, visibility, and care still remained possible. Then even that space weakened as the fire weakened. Across generations, such a pattern does more than organize the hours of the day. It teaches what a day is. It teaches where activity belongs, where safety becomes local, where dependency is gathered, and where the outer world is surrendered. That is why the nights that left no record may still have left a deep inheritance. They trained human life into rhythms that were repeated long before they were ever described. This also helps explain why later, historical change matters so much. When houses became more protective, when lamps and candles became more common, when built interiors became more stable, when lighting could be carried further into the evening, something enormous began to shift. Not because human nature was suddenly replaced, but because one of its oldest nightly limits was slowly loosened. Yet that later transformation only becomes visible when we first understand the older pattern. If we do not grasp how small the evening once was, we cannot understand how large a change it was to make the evening longer, brighter, warmer, and less dependent on a single center of flame. Most nights left no written history, but they created the baseline from which later history departed. They formed the long background against which every later extension of the day would become meaningful. In that sense, the forgotten night is not outside history. It is the deep floor beneath it. It is where countless human beings lived through the same narrowing without naming it, and in doing so gave shape to the ordinary terms of existence. We should be careful, as always, not to turn that background into one single universal scene. There would have been variation in climate, shelter, material culture, and seasonal rhythm. Some evenings were harsher, some calmer, some more social, some more silent. But beneath that variation, the pattern remains compelling and grounded. Most nights did not produce events that history chose to remember, yet they repeatedly produced conditions that history was built upon. The fire may have been the center of those conditions not because it belonged to heroic moments, but because it belonged to ordinary ones. It marked the final zone, where the human world remained organized enough to continue. And if that happened through uncounted evenings across most of our species' past, then perhaps the most forgotten part of human history is also one of the most important. The long repetition of nights in which nothing remarkable happened, except that once again the day became small, the group drew inward, and the fire held the last visible shape of human life before darkness erased the rest. For a very long time, the human evening remained tied to a single center. Light was local, warmth was local, safety, or at least a more manageable version of it, was local. When the fire weakened, the usable world weakened with it. That pattern did not disappear all at once. It began to loosen slowly, unevenly, and over many generations as human beings built environments that could hold back more of the night. This is where houses, lamps, and enclosed spaces enter the story. They did not suddenly free humanity from darkness, but they changed the scale of what could remain human after sunset. If much of human history ended at the fire, then these later changes matter because they mark the beginning of a partial escape from that old limit. A house, even a simple one, already alters the problem. It creates a boundary not made of flame alone. It reduces wind, slows heat loss, and shrinks the amount of open darkness pressing directly against the body. It gives a group a more stable inside. Once that inside exists, the fire no longer has to do all the work by itself. Its warmth can linger longer within enclosed space. Its light can be reflected from nearby surfaces. Its protection becomes less exposed to the wider environment. The evening is still limited, but the limit begins to move outward from the exact edge of the flame. That is a major shift, even if it happens gradually and imperfectly. Near the long middle and later stretches of human history, as more durable shelters and built interiors became common in many societies, the old human circle around the fire did not vanish, but it became embedded within structures that softened the ancient terms of night. Walls mattered because they held a small world together even when light was low. Roofs mattered because they made rest, storage, care, and waiting less dependent on open exposure. The body could remain in a more controlled environment. Children and elders could be kept in more stable conditions. Tasks no longer had to end exactly where the firelight ended in open space, because the larger enclosure itself helped preserve orientation and continuity. Lamps matter in a related but different way. A lamp does not replace the fire completely, especially in earlier periods when fuel was limited and light remained weak by modern standards. But it changes the geography of evening. A flame that can be carried, placed, or multiplied in smaller forms allows human activity to spread beyond one single central source. A person may still not gain a full night in the modern sense, but gain something historically significant: the ability to move light into corners, onto surfaces, through rooms, and into tasks that no longer need to be gathered so tightly around one fire. This is not yet the conquest of darkness. It is the beginning of loosening its grip. The day can now stretch in new ways. Not infinitely, not equally for everyone, and not all at once, but enough to matter. This trick is important because it shows the title from the other side. To say that 90% of human history ended at the fire is also to imply that something changed when human life began to end less strictly there. The change was not instant, and it was not universal, but with houses, enclosed living spaces, lamps, and later more advanced forms of lighting, evening slowly became less like a shrinking circle and more like a managed interior. The human world did not suddenly defeat the night. It began, little by little, to stop surrendering so much of itself the moment the fire weakened. And if that slow escape changed how people rested, gathered, worked, cared, and simply remained awake after sunset, then perhaps one of the great quiet revolutions in human history was not a single invention, but the gradual widening of the evening beyond the old border of the flame. The slow escape from the fire was not a clean break. It was a redistribution. Light that had once been concentrated in one place gradually became movable, divisible, and more deeply integrated into built space. Warmth that had once been tied closely to direct nearness could linger longer inside walls. Human presence after sunset no longer depended so completely on staying within one shared circle. This is why houses and lamps mattered so much. They did not erase the ancient logic of evening, but they began to spread its benefits across a wider interior world. Once that happened, the structure of the night started to change from within. Near the long arc of later human history, a person inside an enclosed space could remain active in ways that would have been harder in open darkness. Objects could be stored and found again in more predictable surroundings. Food preparation, care, and quiet work could continue with less exposure to wind and cold. Children could sleep or wake inside a bounded interior, rather than at the immediate mercy of the outside air. Older adults could remain in a more controlled environment. The fire was still important, often absolutely central, but its role was no longer identical to what it had been in a more open human world. It had help now from architecture. It had surfaces, barriers, and spaces that could hold some of its gains in place. Lamps deepened this change because they broke one of the oldest nightly constraints, the need for all usable light to remain fixed at a single center. A lamp could not create modern abundance, but it could create something historically transformative. It could allow a person to bring light to a task instead of bringing every task to the same fire. That may sound small from a modern point of view, yet over long spans of time it changed the shape of the evening. Once light could be placed in more than one location, the night inside human space became less unified and more differentiated. One person could tend something in one area, while another remained elsewhere. A room or corner could hold activity that would once have collapsed back into the single central circle. The evening began to develop internal variety. This is a major shift in human experience. For most of our past, the narrowing of the day likely pulled many functions into one reduced zone. But once enclosed spaces and portable light became more common, those functions could begin to separate again after sunset. Care, eating, maintenance, storage, thought and rest no longer had to occupy exactly the same patch of illuminated ground. The human world after dark became less compressed. Not limitless, not bright by modern standards, and certainly not identical across all societies, but wider in a meaningful sense. This widening should still be understood carefully. Many homes across history remain dim. Fuels cost labor. Interiors could be smoky, cold, crowded, or seasonally difficult. Night was not suddenly comfortable or safe in every respect. Yet compared with the deep earlier pattern, something real had changed. The border of the human evening no longer sat only at the edge of the fire. It began to include the edge of the room, the reach of a carried lamp, the protected interior, the retained warmth of enclosed space. The day did not stop ending after sunset, but it ended differently. It became less of a collapse into one point, and more of a gradual withdrawal into structured indoor life. That is why this stage in the story matters so much. It marks the first serious loosening of one of the oldest limits on human time. The night was still larger than the human world, but the human world had begun to spread into it through walls, roofs, and smaller flames that could travel where the old central fire could not. And if that process unfolded slowly across generations, then perhaps one of the quiet turning points in history was the moment evening stopped being only a circle around fire and started becoming a set of spaces in which human life could continue, unevenly but unmistakably, beyond it. What changed most in the end was not simply lighting technology, it was the shape of dependence. For most of human history, the evening depended on staying close to one center where light, warmth, visibility, and social coordination could still survive together. As houses improved, as interior space became more durable, and as smaller forms of light could be placed and carried, that dependence began to loosen. Human life after sunset no longer had to gather so completely into one shrinking point. It could spread, cautiously and unevenly, into a wider interior world. This is the deepest meaning of the slow escape from the fire. People did not leave fire behind all at once. They stopped needing everything to happen directly beside it. Near the long later arc of human history, this would have altered evening in ways both practical and subtle. A room could hold warmth longer than open air. A wall could block wind whether or not someone was actively feeding a flame. A lamp could preserve visibility for a specific task without requiring the whole group to remain in the same exact place. Rest could happen in one part of a shelter while work or care continued in another. Objects could remain within a known enclosed environment even when darkness lay outside. The body still had limits, and night still imposed them, but those limits no longer collapsed all activity into one circle as completely as before. That is why the change matters so much for the title. If most of human history ended at the fire, then the long historical shift that followed can be understood as a gradual movement away from that ending point. Not because humans became independent of light or warmth, but because they built systems that made light and warmth less singular, less exposed, and less tied to one exact center. Evening became less like a final compression and more like a managed interior extension. The difference may sound modest, but it transforms the structure of life. Once the evening is no longer bound to one flame, people can begin to occupy darkness in new ways. The group no longer has to remain so tightly unified in space. Tasks no longer have to wait for daylight or cluster at one source of fire. Care can be distributed through rooms. Food can be handled in more stable surroundings. Silence itself changes, because it now unfolds within architecture, rather than in immediate relation to open night. This does not mean the old pattern vanished. In many societies, for long periods, fire remained central in every practical sense. Even in more developed interiors, darkness still narrowed movement, fuel still had to be managed, and night still placed strong limits on what was easy or safe. But the balance had shifted. Fire was becoming part of a broader human environment instead of being the sole center that held that environment together after sunset. That is the real transition of this truk. The human evening began to detach, slowly, from its oldest anchor, and once that detachment began, history moved toward a world we now find normal, a world in which the end of the day is no longer decided so directly by the weakening of a single flame. Seen this way, houses and lamps were not just improvements in comfort, they were historical instruments that widened the human claim on the night. They did not conquer darkness in one stroke, but they diluted one of its oldest powers, the power to force life back to one center and stop it there. If that is true, then perhaps the long escape from the fire was not simply a story about better shelter or better tools. It was a story about how humans slowly changed the place where a day could end, until the old border of flame was no longer the final edge of the human world. The modern night feels normal only because we were born inside an exception. Lights come on without effort. Warmth can remain inside walls for hours. Doors close, windows seal, streets stay visible. A person can continue working, reading, eating, speaking, traveling, or simply remaining awake long after sunset without feeling that the world has withdrawn its permission. This experience is now so familiar that it can seem timeless, but measured against the full length of human history, it is remarkably new. For most humans who ever lived, night was not a stable extension of the day. It was a reduction of it. The visible world became smaller. The body became more constrained. The group drew inward. The fire, or later a similarly limited source of warmth and light, marked the last place where ordinary life could continue in reduced form. That is why this truk matters. It shifts the question from the past to the present. To understand why so much of human history may have ended at the fire, we also have to understand that our own relationship to evening is historically unusual. Near the beginning of our species, the day could not simply continue because people wished it to. After sunset, visibility, warmth, footing, social coordination, and the ability to act across space all narrowed. That narrowing shaped not only what people did, but what a day was. The evening was often small because the human world after dark was small. Today, by contrast, many people move through a night that has been widened by architecture, heating, portable illumination, electric infrastructure, and social systems built to support activity after sunset. The difference is enormous. We do not merely have brighter nights. We have nights that remain legible, structured, and useful in ways that would have been impossible for most of the human past. This is why the modern night should be understood as an exception, not the rule. It is not the natural form of evening finally achieved. It is a historically specific condition created by layers of technology, labor, fuel, design, and collective organization. Even the simplest act of remaining awake comfortably after dark now depends on supports that did not exist for most of our species' existence. A room that stays warm, a lamp that lasts, a building that holds weather back, a city that remains navigable, a home where distance from darkness feels secure. These are not ancient defaults. They are later achievements, and because they are so complete around us, they can hide from us the scale of what changed. The title of this video begins to sound different once we notice that. Ended at the fire is not only a sentence about the past, it is also a sentence that reveals how recent our present is. We live in a world where the day often ends by preference, schedule, or exhaustion. Most humans lived in a world where the day ended when the conditions for extending it grew too weak to hold. Fire delayed that ending for a while. Modern systems delay it far longer, but the older pattern lasted for vastly more of human time. That is the deeper proportion hidden inside the phrase 90% of human history. It reminds us that the broad, bright, usable night many people now inhabit is not the baseline experience of being human. It is a late departure from it, and if that is true, then perhaps one of the strangest things about the modern world is not that we stay up late, but that we rarely notice how historically unusual it is to have so much of the night belong to us at all. One way to feel how unusual the modern night is to imagine removing, one by one, the systems that now make it seem effortless. Remove electric light, and evening shrinks immediately. Remove heated interiors, and the body feels the surrounding air again. Remove sealed rooms, paved routes, predictable storage, and stable domestic space, and darkness begins to recover its older force. The modern night is spacious not because human beings changed into a new species, but because we surrounded ourselves with layers of support that keep darkness from reclaiming so much of the world. This is what makes our present an exception. It is built, maintained, powered, repaired, and socially organized every day. Without those supports, much of the ancient structure would return very quickly. Near the beginning of our species, of course, there was no such layered protection. Night arrived not into systems designed to resist it, but into bodies and groups that had to negotiate with it directly. The fire created a local solution. Later houses, lamps, and enclosed spaces widened that solution somewhat, but the full modern condition, in which large parts of life can continue almost unchanged after sunset, is far more recent and far more artificial than it usually feels. That is why this truck matters. It helps us see that our own experience can easily mislead us about the past. We tend to think of darkness now as a backdrop rather than a force. It surrounds human life, but does not usually decide its terms. We can step into another room, turn on another light, continue another task, and feel that the night remains available. For most of human history, that was not true. Darkness was not just something outside the window. It was a condition that changed what the body could do, how far the group could extend itself, how much of the world remained readable, and how long ordinary activity could continue before narrowing inward. Once we understand this, modern life begins to look less like the completion of a timeless human desire and more like a remarkable departure from ancient limits. Our evenings are wide because they are supported by invisible labor and material systems. Fuel is extracted, power is transmitted, buildings are insulated, streets are maintained. Glass, wiring, heating, and design all hold back conditions that once ended the day much sooner. In a deep historical sense, we do not merely stay awake later. We inhabit a larger human territory after dark than most people who ever lived could reliably inhabit. This does not mean every modern life is equally protected, or that all societies experience night in the same way. Even now, access to warmth, infrastructure, lighting, and security varies enormously, but the broad contrast still stands. Compared with the long span of the human past, the modern night is structurally unusual. It is brighter, warmer, more navigable, and less concentrated around a single flame. That difference helps reinterpret the title at an even deeper level. Why 90% of human history ended at the fire is not only about why ancient evenings were small, it is about why ours are so unusually large. The title asks us to reverse our instinct. Instead of treating the past as primitive compared with a normal present, It asks us to see the present as exceptional compared with a very long human baseline. And if that baseline was shaped night after night by the shrinking of life toward one source of light and warmth, then perhaps the real historical puzzle is not why the old day ended at the fire, but how we built a world in which so much of the night no longer has to. The modern night does more than keep us awake. It changes what we assume a human life is allowed to do. Because light, warmth, and enclosure now remain available after sunset, many people experience the evening as open territory. It can hold work, privacy, movement, study, entertainment, care, conversation, and long stretches of solitary thought without forcing those activities back into one shared center. The body no longer feels night as an immediate contraction of possibility in the way it once did for most of our species. That may be the deepest reason the modern night is an exception. It does not merely add comfort, it removes one of the oldest daily limits on human range. Near the beginning of our species, the world after sunset likely became smaller in almost every practical sense. Vision narrowed. Warmth became more precious. Movement lost confidence. Social coordination compressed into a more local form. The fire created a last zone where life could continue, but only within a reduced field. For immense stretches of time, that may have been the normal shape of evening. What we now treat as ordinary would have been extraordinary. Rooms still bright, hours after dark, tasks continuing far from a central flame, people separating into different spaces while remaining inside the same usable night. A sense that the world is still there for us, even when the sun is gone. This is why the title matters, even to a modern listener. It is not only a statement about ancient life, it is a mirror held up to our own assumptions. We often believe that the ability to continue after sunset belongs naturally to human freedom. But freedom after dark is never just personal. It is historical and material. It depends on systems that widen the evening and make the night obey a human schedule more than a natural one. Once we see that, our present becomes less invisible. It becomes something built, something maintained, something that could not have been taken for granted across most of human existence. That change also affects the meaning of the day itself. If the old human day often ended where fire could no longer hold back darkness, then the modern day often ends where intention gives out instead. We stop because we choose to stop, because our work is done, because we are tired, or because our clocks tell us to. That is a very different relationship to time. The external limit has weakened. The boundary has moved inward. Night no longer closes the world around us as tightly, so we carry a larger world later into wakefulness. This is a rare historical condition, even if it now feels routine. Of course, this exception is not absolute. Even modern people still live through bodies that tire, cool, and seek rest. Darkness can still affect mood, perception, and movement. Many places in the world remain far closer to older limits than wealthy, electrified settings do. And no technology has erased the ancient fact that the human body was not originally shaped to command the night with ease. What has changed is the scale of support around that body. The environment has been altered so thoroughly that the old narrowing is often hidden from us. That is why this trek must end carefully. The modern night is not the final truth of human life. It is a recent arrangement placed over a much longer past. And if we forget that, we also forget what the title is trying to recover. The idea that for most humans who ever lived, evening was not a wide and stable realm, but a shrinking remainder held together near a fire. Perhaps the most unusual thing about us is not simply that we have light after dark, but that we have come to believe the dark was always meant to leave us so much room. When the fire stopped being the unquestioned center of evening, humanity gained an enormous freedom. The night became wider, safer, more divided into separate spaces, and less dependent on keeping one fragile source of light alive. That gain is real, and it should not be romanticized away. Yet when a structure that old begins to loosen, something is often lost as well. Not necessarily something better, and not something we should wish to fully restore, but something deep enough to matter. For most of human history, the end of the day likely drew people inward toward one shared point, where warmth, visibility, food, care, and social attention still overlapped. That arrangement was imposed by limits. Yet over time, limits can create forms of life. Once the limits weaken, the forms weaken with them. This is why the question of loss belongs here. If much of human history ended at the fire, then the disappearance of that pattern may have changed not only comfort and efficiency, but also the texture of human presence in the evening. Near the beginning of our species, and through much of the long human past, the fire did not simply light the dark. It concentrated the group. It made faces legible at the same distance. It gave bodies one shared climate. It gathered different generations into one practical centre. The day closed not in many private directions, but in one reduced common space. That may have created a kind of togetherness that was less chosen than necessary, but no less real for that reason. People did not have to decide whether to remain inside the same circle. Often the conditions of night made that circle the natural place where ordinary life could still continue. Once evening became wider through enclosed rooms, lamps, heating, and later more powerful systems of light, the gains were obvious. But the centre also began to dissolve. Light could be carried elsewhere, warmth could be distributed, tasks could separate, rest and activity could occur in different spaces. The human group no longer had to gather so tightly in order to remain functional after sunset. This was a triumph of history in many ways. Yet it may also have thinned one of the oldest nightly structures of shared human life. The fire had once created not only proximity, but a common scale of attention. Everyone was oriented, more or less, toward the same visible field. The same faces, the same source of warmth, the same edge of darkness, the same final transition out of daylight. That kind of shared narrowing may have carried consequences we no longer easily feel because our evenings now disperse so quickly into separate rooms, separate lights, separate tasks, and separate internal worlds. It is important to remain careful here. We should not turn the ancient fire into a sentimental symbol of perfect community. Human groups have always included conflict, fatigue, silence, inequality, and strain. Not every shared circle is intimate, and not every old pattern is wise. The point is not that something pure was lost. The point is smaller and more grounded. When the fire stopped being the centre, evening stopped requiring the same kind of collective compression. Human beings gain more room, but often at the cost of having less unavoidable nearness. A day could now end in fragments instead of in one visible centre. That may be one of the quiet losses hidden inside modern freedom. Not the loss of fire itself, but the loss of a nightly condition in which the human group, however imperfectly, was brought back into one shared space before darkness took the rest. And if that condition shaped countless evenings across most of our past, then perhaps one of the things that disappeared with the old central fire was not merely a source of light, but a very old way of ending the day together. What may have been lost then was not only a source of light, but a shared field of human attention. A central fire does something unusual to perception. It gathers the eye, the body, and the group into one visible frame, even when people are tired, even when little is said, even when hands are occupied with separate small tasks. Everyone remains inside the same circle of warmth and visibility. The same light touches each face. The same darkness waits just beyond reach. The same narrowing of the world is felt together. That kind of shared boundary may have shaped human evenings for so long that it became almost invisible within ordinary life. For most of the past, the end of the day likely did not scatter people into many private directions. It drew them inward to one reduced space where food, warmth, care, rest, and awareness of one another could still remain joined. That arrangement was limiting, but it also created a common scale of experience. People were not only near each other, they were near the same source, under the same conditions, with fewer places for attention to go. Children remained in sight, older bodies remained in reach. Small changes in posture, fatigue, discomfort, or need were more likely to be noticed because the group stayed inside one compressed field. Even silence had a collective quality, because it was held inside shared light rather than dispersed across separate rooms and separate tasks. Once evening became broader through walls, lamps, stored fuel, heating, and later far stronger forms of illumination, that common frame began to loosen. Human life after sunset gained comfort, safety, privacy, and flexibility. Those gains were real and immense, but they also changed the texture of togetherness. People no longer had to remain in one visible cluster in order to continue the evening. They could divide without surrendering to darkness. They could move into separate corners, separate rooms, separate rhythms, and eventually into very different personal worlds while still remaining physically sheltered. The day no longer had to close in one shared radius. It could dissolve into many smaller endings. That may be one of the quietest transformations in human history. For a very long time, the limits of night may have forced a kind of collective awareness that modern life does not require in the same way. Not because earlier humans were morally better at being together, and not because every shared circle was warm or harmonious, but because separation was more costly. The conditions of darkness kept many needs concentrated in one place. Once those needs could be distributed through architecture and technology, the pressure to remain visibly present to one another weakened. This is not a simple story of decline. Privacy can protect. Comfort can reduce suffering. Personal space can make life gentler and more bearable. Yet the old center still reveals something important about the human past. It shows that for most of our history, evening was not only a time of reduced activity, it was a time when human beings were repeatedly brought back into one another's presence by the structure of the world itself. The fire made distance harder. Modern evening makes distance easy. The fire held attention in common. Modern evening lets attention separate without much cost. And if most of human history unfolded under conditions where the day ended in one shared circle of light, then perhaps one of the deepest changes of modern life is that we no longer need to witness the end of the day together in order to pass safely through it. What disappeared with the old central fire, perhaps, was a certain kind of unavoidable ending. For most of the human past, the close of the day may have gathered people back into one final shared condition. However different their roles had been in daylight, however widely effort had spread across land, however unequal bodies and needs remained, the evening often narrowed those differences into one visible place. There, the group still had to exist within one common temperature, one common range of light, one common edge of darkness. No one was fully outside that shared limit. The same shrinking world held everyone. That may have given the end of the day a kind of unity that modern life rarely preserves. Today, the day often ends in fragments. One person keeps working, another scrolls through light carried in the hand, another falls asleep in a separate room, another remains awake alone, surrounded by warmth and brightness that no longer need anyone else's presence in order to continue. This is an extraordinary gain in freedom, and yet it also means that the ending of the day has become individualized. It no longer gathers human beings into one necessary center. For most of our history, it may have done exactly that. The fire did not merely illuminate faces, it synchronized limits. It made everyone answer, in one way or another, to the same final conditions of evening. That may be one reason it became so deeply embedded in the structure of human life, not because it was sacred in every setting, and not because every gathering was harmonious, but because it was one of the last places where difference had to coexist inside one frame. The strongest and weakest, the youngest and oldest, the tired and the watchful, all remained within a single small world while the larger one withdrew. Once that condition loosened, something subtle changed in the human experience of time. Evening stopped being a common descent and became, more often, a series of parallel private descents. The world after sunset grew larger for the individual, but the final shape of the day grew less shared. This may be one of the quiet prices of modern success. We have protected ourselves from the ancient narrowing of the night, so effectively that we have also loosened one of the oldest patterns by which people ended the day in each other's sight. It would be foolish to wish back the hardship that made that pattern necessary. The past was not gentle simply because it was close. Cold, limitation, and dependence are not virtues by themselves, but neither should we ignore what those limits once created. They created a repeated human scene in which the final usable space of the day was common space. A person could not easily disappear into private light because private light barely existed. Human presence had to remain, for a while, mutual. That may be the deepest loss hidden inside the fading of the fire as evening's center. Not the loss of simplicity, not the loss of some imagined purity, but the loss of a nightly structure in which the human group was brought back together by necessity before rest. Darkness and silence separated everyone further, And if that structure held across uncounted evenings for most of our past, then perhaps one of the strangest facts about modern life is this. We have gained the power to continue the day almost wherever we want. But in doing so, we may also have lost one of the oldest ways human beings once knew how to end it together. Even now, the day still ends somewhere. It no longer ends where most of human history once ended, and for many people it no longer ends because darkness makes the world unusable. Yet the deeper pattern has not vanished. However much modern life widens the evening, however far light, heat, and shelter have pushed back the old limits, the human day still depends on some final boundary beyond which it cannot continue in the same way. The ancient fire was one form of that boundary. It marked the last place where warmth, visibility, food, nearness, and shared attention could still be held together before the wider dark took over. We no longer gather around that same edge in the same way, but we have not escaped the need for an edge itself. That is the first idea that matters at the end of this story. The question is no longer only where the day once ended. It is where it ends now, and what that reveals about us. For most of our past, the answer was physical and visible. The light shrank. The world narrowed. The body accepted its reduced range. The group drew inward. The fire held one last small human center, and beyond it the night resumed its older authority. In the modern world, that boundary has become less obvious because it has moved. It may now lie in fatigue rather than cold, in mental exhaustion rather than darkness, in the body's need for stillness rather than in the immediate failure of light. But it remains a real limit. We still cannot live indefinitely in expansion. We still cannot remain outward forever. Even when technology carries the day far past sunset, human life must eventually fold inward. We withdraw from tasks, from distance, from effort, from noise, from decision. The old structure survives in altered form. The day opens outward, then closes inward. What has changed is not the existence of that movement, but the place where it happens. Near the beginning of our species, that inward return was often gathered around fire because fire was where the world remained human for a little longer. Today, the final inward return may happen in a lit room, behind a door, beneath a blanket, inside private thought, or in the quiet glow of systems so familiar that we forget how new they are. Yet, all of these are, in their own ways, descendants of the same ancient need, to create a last human space before the body gives itself to rest, and the world outside recedes from use. This matters because it keeps the title from becoming a statement only about loss. It is also a statement about continuity. The old fire is gone from the center of many lives, but the human need for a final center has not disappeared. We still look for a place where the day can stop without collapsing. We still need some small protected zone where the body can surrender its outward labor and become local again. We still end the day by making the world smaller. That may be the deepest bridge between us and the people who lived through those uncounted ancient evenings. Their world shrank around a flame. Ours shrinks in more private, dispersed, and technologically supported ways. But shrinking remains. The outward day still cannot continue forever. And if that is true, then perhaps the old fire was never only a prehistoric tool. Perhaps it was the earliest clear form of a human necessity that still lives inside us now. The need to find, before night is complete, one final place where the day can become small enough to end. The great difference between us and most humans who ever lived is not that we no longer need a center at the end of the day. It is that our centers have multiplied, softened, and become easier to mistake for private choice. A bed, a room, a lamp, a screen, a closed door, a familiar corner, the last warm place where thought slows and the body stops reaching outward. These now serve, in many lives, the role that fire once served far more plainly. They mark the final reduction of the world. They gather the last remains of attention. They create a small zone where the day can release its hold. We may not see these places as descendants of the ancient evening, yet in a deep sense they are. They are the modern forms of the last human space before rest. For most of our past, that space was visible to everyone in the group. It had a shared center. Its edge could be seen in the dark. Its warmth had to be maintained in common. Today, that final center is often individualized. Each person may disappear into a separate ending. The room is private. The light is personal. The final thoughts of the day unfold alone. This is one reason modern life can feel so different without seeming to have changed the underlying structure. We still reduce the world before sleep. We still move from the wide and demanding into the narrow and protected. But we do so now through many separate enclosures rather than one common circle. That shift may be one of the most profound changes hidden beneath ordinary comfort. Near the beginning of our species, the end of the day had a visible social form. It pulled bodies together because the world outside had grown too difficult to remain broadly human in. The final usable space was usually common space. In the modern world, technology allows that final usable space to be divided, repeated, personalized. This is a liberation, but it is also a transformation of how human beings inhabit the end of time each evening. We no longer descend toward one ending. We descend toward many. Yet even here the continuity remains stronger than it first appears. The body still cannot live without closure. Attention still cannot remain stretched forever. Warmth, safety, and reduced stimulation still matter. Human beings still need some final arrangement in which activity gives way to stillness. The old fire made that arrangement obvious. The modern world hides it under abundance. Because we can prolong the day so far, we sometimes imagine that we have escaped the ancient pattern altogether. But perhaps we have only covered it over. We still make the world smaller before sleep. We still retreat into bounded conditions. We still rely on protected spaces to bridge the distance between wakeful life and night. In that sense, the ancient fire has not disappeared completely. It survives as a pattern, even where the flame itself no longer stands at the center. This is why the ending of the video should remain open rather than final. The story was never only about a campfire, a hearth, or a prehistoric evening. It was about the oldest human problem of all: how a species too exposed for the dark, too social for isolation, and too conscious to stop all at once learned to create a final place of reduction before the world slipped from use. For most of history, that place was the fire. Now it is something else, or many things. But perhaps the real question was never only why so much of human history ended there. Perhaps the deeper question is why human life, even now, still seems to need some last small world in order to let the day go. For most of human history, the day did not end because human beings had mastered it. It ended because the world withdrew. Light failed, warmth became local, distance grew uncertain, and life folded inward toward the last place where it could still remain organized. That place was often the fire, not because fire solved everything, and not because the past was made of one simple universal scene, but because fire held together, for a little longer, the conditions under which human beings could still live as human beings do, seeing one another, feeding one another, warming one another, and remaining within a world that was still small enough to understand. That is what this story has really been about. Not only a flame in the dark, but the boundary between a world we could still inhabit and a world that had become too large, too cold, too dim, or too uncertain to remain fully ours. The modern world has pushed that boundary far away. Many people now live inside nights that seem open, stable, and almost endless in their usefulness. We can work, travel, read, eat, think, and remain awake long after sunset without feeling the ancient reduction that shaped most of our species past. This is an extraordinary achievement. It deserves gratitude rather than contempt. Yet it also carries a quiet lesson. When a limit disappears from daily life, we often stop seeing what it once taught. The old fire taught scale. It taught that human beings are not separate from environment, but held within it. It taught that the body has terms, that attention has limits, that care becomes most visible when the world gets smaller, and that much of what keeps a group alive is not grand at all. It is local, repeated, ordinary, and shared. Warmth, nearness. Food, rest. Watchfulness. The final gathering of effort into one survivable space. That may be the educational value of this long history. It reminds us that human life was not built first on endless control. It was built on learning how to live honestly inside limits, and how to protect one another within them. The fire matters because it was one of the clearest early tools for doing that. It gave no perfect safety. It offered no full victory over the night. But it created enough order, enough warmth, enough visibility, enough time for human beings to remain together before darkness closed further. And perhaps that is still a useful lesson now, even in a world brighter than anything most of our ancestors ever knew. A meaningful human life may not depend only on expanding farther into the night, doing more, staying awake longer, or filling every dark hour with more activity. It may also depend on knowing how to make the world small again, deliberately and wisely, so that the body can rest, the mind can quiet, and other people remain visible to us before the day is gone. If the old fire has anything left to teach, it may be this. Civilization did not begin with escaping every limit, but with learning how to create a small circle of care inside them. And if that was true for most of the human journey, then as we sit inside our wider, brighter nights, what is the last small world we still need in order to remain human when the day is over?